The cold is a way to enter into the stress mechanisms inside of the brain.
Whatever ailment you are facing, it is more than likely that sleep has a tool in the box to try and help fight it.
If you're feeling stressed out, you're feeling anxious or angry, it's going to change your brain chemistry in a way that gives you more hope and more energy.
Everybody in the world should take the damn beautiful cold shower a day. It is not difficult, and the investment is by far the outcome. You get so much more energy and so much more peace because the stress will go out of your body.
We can think of muscles, right? Everyone understands muscles, and they know if you go to the gym and work your muscles, they will grow stronger. So as you were describing that about cold showers, I'm thinking we live these comfortable lives. We have temperature controlled houses. If we go out, we don't want to feel hot. We don't want to feel cold. We put on our jackets and our fleeces. So our blood vessels are never, in some way you could say, are never been exposed to those sort of extremes where our body then responds and adapts. And I guess having that cold shower is an intentional way of providing, I guess, like a helpful dose of stress to the vascular system, which will cause it to grow back stronger. Is that a fair analogy?
Absolutely, absolutely. The blood flow is going to be better. The muscle tone is going to be better. The heart rate goes absolutely down. Absence of cortisol presence, thus oxidative stress. And yeah, sleep is better. Anything is better. The hormonal system the endocrine system is being fed a lot better. It's all about the blood flow. The blood flow is everywhere in our body. Only we cover up our bodies, and thus actually we suffocate our body. It's breathing. The body needs to breathe, and the cold shower does it. It compensates for our covering up the rest of the day, and we get great amounts of energy back.
If someone's listening to this and thinking, okay, Wim, I see what you're saying, but I can't take it. I get cold a lot. It's too cold for me. What would you say to that person?
For the people who have low energy, because when it's cold, they feel sensitive, is because the maintenance of their body is at work at that moment, and it takes all the energy at that moment to maintain a normal core body temperature, and for the rest they feel like shivering because there's no energy left. Take the cold shower. I know this for thousands of people with problems with the cold, having low energy levels, and being sick a lot of times because of the lowering energy. It's a lower alertness of the immune system. After taking the cold showers, suddenly they burst with a lot more energy. They don't become sick anymore, and it's all logical because their muscle tone is back. And with that, the oxidative stress goes out. You get more energy. So you will never feel cold anymore. Taking the cold shower is a hormetic stress exercise. Yeah. A hormetic stress, which actually is positive stress exercise, which neurologically at will makes you able to control your body whenever you get stressed out in any shape. Could be emotional stress, mental stress, physical, bacterial, viral, it does not matter. Now at will, because you are the one who goes consciously into the cold shower, you learn to change your neurology, your power of will against any stressor. The cold is only a mirror. The cold is a way to enter into the stress mechanisms inside of the brain. I know you want it, only we have this paradigm in our society that, and that is from the prehistorics when it was cold outside, that was the enemy, and it's still built in, this primal aversive feeling of, hey, cold out there, no, we have to win out there. No, the cold can be a positive stressor to like a vaccination. It's like a vaccination.
It feels very much as though with that intentional dose of stress each morning or each evening, you start to build up that immune system resilience, that vascular resilience, that stress resilience, which is going to help you for the other 23 and a half hours of the day. And that, it feels like a really exciting practice that we can do. But then you just mentioned a phrase, and it's, as I was reading your book this morning, and you said, there's a phrase in it that you just mentioned, which is, the cold is a mirror. And I stopped, I put my drink down, and I read it again. It was one of those phrases that makes me stop and just think. And I think, wow, that's so profound, because I was then thinking, so if you're someone who doesn't like the cold, that's teaching you something about what else you don't like in life. It's teaching you about your resistance to certain things. I don't know. I mean, I wonder if you could expand on that, because I think that's a really interesting perspective. The cold is a mirror.
Oh, yes. The cold is a mirror. It shows you how you're physiologically, not only, also mentally, spiritually, are in a lockdown. When you go into the cold showers, suddenly it locks down. You are paralyzed. And it could be very much that it has got to do with a traumatic experience in the past, that it has psychosomatically has set in. And you think it is the cold. Oh, I don't like the cold. No, you got to solve something, because that old trauma is coming to the surface when you take a cold trigger, which takes away your normal conditioning. You have to learn to let go. And that learning to let go at that moment is so beautiful, because very soon after you go into the cold shower, suddenly you feel, oh, I can do this. I can even sing. I can make a dance. Wow, and I feel so great. Yes, that is the nature of trauma, blockages, fears, our concept of what the cold is. It is a great way to get into the depth of who you are and what you are. If you learn about the cold, and you see you can learn to let go therein, then suddenly you will see that you are ready for any stressor. Like you look in the mirror in the morning, do I look right? Yeah, maybe this hair, a little bit this way, and nice, good. Yeah, I'm ready. So if you take the cold shower, you are going to be ready for any kind of stress in the world. And that could be soliciting for a job, or get a big deal, or a marriage, or you want to ask your future wife, would you please marry with all your brilliance of being? All that you got within the control, because you learn to tap into the fullness of your blood flow, the fullness of being, by going into the cold shower. You break the conditioning and you step out into the fullness of your whole being. And then suddenly the flow is there, and that becomes one with who you are and what you are in your consciousness. Because in the end, the consciousness is that what they say still 16%. We showed 100%. 100. It's like a little baby in your hands. There's nothing wrong with the baby. The legs, there's nothing wrong with the baby. It's a beautiful baby, but it is still not able to walk. It takes a little time to neurologically set. It takes a little time to neurologically set the access and linking up into all the parts of our brain. But that's the way nature meant us to be, to learn to walk spiritually strong, being brilliant and full bloom, and realized the soul as it is the purpose of our life. That's a cold shower.
Yeah.
That's a mirror.
I mean, you might be able to see just behind me there on the wall.
Yeah, it already intrigued me.
Did it intrigue you? Yes. So for people watching on YouTube, there's I talk to my kids a lot about this stuff, and we do a bit of breathing together. And I talk to them about my favorite Viktor Frankl quotes. And my daughter has summarized it there. Between stimulus and response is a space. And in that space sits choice. That's her summary of what Daddy's been teaching her.
Wow.
And I thought about that in the context of the cold shower. You're saying, and I know breathing would come into this as well, but these regular daily practices help grow that space between stressor and response. You make that space bigger, right? So you can actually start to choose the way you respond to the world rather than the world kind of, making you almost a slave to it. So you're just responding and reacting to everyone around you. You start to be in control of your life.
Exactly.
Just over a year ago, I have mentioned this on the podcast before. I went and did something called a swim run event where you're in a wetsuit and your trainers, and you run in your wetsuit, then you jump in the ocean, you swim, and then you get out and you run, and then you swim. I went and signed up for an event, even though I'd never, ever been in the ocean before to swim. And, maybe 100 meters in, I freaked out. I was scared. I had a panic attack. It was cold. It was in the UK early on in the season. So the ocean was still very cold. I had never done it before. And in that moment, I was scared. Now, I did manage to overcome it and then complete the whole race, which I was very, very proud of. But that was cold exposure. That was fear of never having been in the ocean before. And I suspect now, talking to you, that had I, let's say for 2 months prior to that, taken a cold shower every day and done your breathing practice every day, of course, I'll never know, but I suspect that maybe I wouldn't have reacted in that way. Maybe I would have been used to the cold. Maybe I would have had a tool to control my breath in that moment. I mean, what do you think?
Yes, I get people within 2 days, even they are 80 years of age and never have been in an ice bath. And even with heart problems like cardiac bypasses. And yes, and they tell me, and I learned to have them at ease with feeling, go into the ice bath, breathe. As I've taught them, it's not difficult. And then they are able to stay within 2 days, or even within 1 day, to stay like for 2 minutes in freezing ice water.
Yeah.
And be completely in control. And this is only showing that people of any age are actually innately capacitated to meet their stressor. And it's built in only. We are so conditioned and so conditioned in our mindset that we panic when we do not have our control anymore, while our control should be over much more inside. Yeah. But we never got into that. It's like the house, only 16% of the house you think is yours. No, it's all the house. There is much more to meet. And the cold shows. You could stay there in the water, you completed it, but it was at the cost of a sort of a panic moment and feeling painful, maybe at that moment, but you got through. You got at that moment through your own conditioning. That was, otherwise you would not have survived. But your conditioning got past, and then you let go, and you could do it. That's what you saw. And so it is. We have a limited power through our conditioned brain. And then we are in fear with that what possibly is able to happen in our lives, like stresses of any kind, emotional, mental, bacterial, any kind of stressor, because we are too much learned and schooled that we are not able to take on those stresses. And I tell now the people, the cold has shown me, and the cold has shown me how to control the stress mechanisms inside my brain, which makes me able to deal about with any kind of stress. And in the end, it is to get on my path to the realization of my soul. And the purpose is to get through any kind of stressor coming to you in peace, through observation, contemplation, toward the realization of my goal. And that sounds far-fetched, but here it is. That is going to be the new paradigm, where everybody is able to take on any stress. And that's what we have to teach the people. It is there, guys. We found ways, very accessible, very effective, and scientifically endorsed, that enables you to take on the stress in your life much better, because you will learn to have a control over the stress mechanisms inside of you. And this was not before, but now it's here.
When someone's underneath the cold water, right? First of all, how cold does it need to be? Does it need to be cold enough to give them a shock? Is the first question. Then the second question, just to be super practical, you can have cold water over your head and you can tense up and last 10 or 15 seconds if you have to, but that's going to be very different than if you have the cold water and you lean into it and you relax and you breathe. So for people who feel inspired to go, okay, all right, Wim, I'm going to try and have a cold shower. What is the minimum amount of time they need? What is the temperature they need it to be? And is there a difference if they're tensed or whether they're relaxed and slow breathing?
Exactly. So first of all, know that everybody is capacitated by nature, by birthright, to go into this stressful natural environment called the cold. So a cold shower is cold. A cold shower you are able to take on any day. That's the first one to know. Now, if you are in a vascular condition which has been alienated from going into the cold stress ever, then of course you have to take it step by step. But it goes very fast. You begin with a hot shower, and then you get into the last 30 seconds of cold. Turn it to cold, and then your vascular system is very well able to, in this case, passively, because you got into the heat of the hot shower, then it works like a sauna, and then have a cold dip. It's passive because you got a lot of heat, and so you are able to lose a lot of heat passively through taking on the cold shower. But 30 seconds to begin with is activating, igniting the memory cells within you, the genome expressions in the cell to adapt to the situation. That's the way the DNA works. So in 30 seconds, it's able to be activated to give this spark of neural activity that initiates a different neural activity that directly influences into the vascular system. The vascular system and the neurology are tied together, and they know how to act. And in the 30 seconds, to begin with, anybody can do that. And from 30 seconds, the other day you do 40 seconds, 50 seconds, up to 2 minutes. In 10 days, everybody is able to take for 2 minutes a cold shower, 2-3 minutes. And at that point, you are back at your natural condition of your vascular system, is when you are able to get into, say, natural bodies of water, like in the UK in wintertime. And we are, in the end, mammals, guys, and it's great to feel the mammal inside, because it's very powerful. You know that mammals are very powerful in weather. They sleep outside in rain and the cold and this and that. See how far we got away from that.
Yeah.
So once a day, getting into a cold shower, everybody is able to do. And with that, the outcome is tremendous. Many books can be written just on the outcome of what a cold shower is doing. Physically, mentally, astrally, spiritually, emotionally. It's all different bodies at work because it all relates to a great blood flow. The transportation of ours, the vascular system, is being uptoned through the cold shower.
So in the winter in the Netherlands, if you were to go into a lake, right, a cold natural lake, you're going to go with no wetsuit. Is that right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, wetsuits, no.
And okay, so
I have no money for wetsuits, so.
Okay, so look, let's say then it's July now in the UK as we have this conversation, right? If I have a cold shower from now, every day until winter,
Yes.
Right? Do you think I can, in November or December, whether here or whether I fly out to see you, do you think I can also swim in a lake that's super cold without a wetsuit?
Yes. Always take it easy. Remember the breathing. The breathing, we haven't been talking about the breathing yet.
We're coming to that. We'll get to that for sure.
Yes. So I say
so you
yes.
You think it's possible?
Yes, absolutely. I train people within 2 days to do incredible stuff. And it's amazing because it's only 2 days.
Yeah.
What is happening when people suddenly double their push-ups without breathing? When they are suddenly able to do endurance feats, and they thought of they could not do even the half of it. And then within 2 days, it doubles. What is that? And then going into the cold, like freezing ice water. How to do that? And going, yes, within 25 minutes, up to 3 minutes without air in the lungs.
Yeah.
That is tapping into a greater potential within yourself. And that is only the start. That's only the beginning.
Only the start. Yeah. So I want to get to the breath, but just to finish off on the cold, Wim, if you don't mind, when they're in the cold shower, do they then need to do anything with their breath? Or, you know, is there something people should be trying to do? Or they just need to tolerate the cold for as long as they can?
Don't cramp up, follow the breath. Don't cramp up, no contraction of your muscles. You can, what do you do is when you really feel cold, and it's not cold right now, guys. The cold shower is good. It's thermogenesis. You are exercising the vascular system when you take a cold shower now. That is great. But in winter, you're going to meet your true self within the elements of nature. And that is a great experience. And for that, we condition our vascular system. And it always goes through long out breaths. This is the way you go into the cold shower, and then the body is able not to get into panic, not into paranoia. No, it's able to adapt. The thermogenesis is able to do what the body is able to do. If you do this, then the body is not able to do what the body is able to do.
And then can you build up from this into, let's say, if you have a bath in your house, you can run a bath with cold water, and then you can take a cold bath as well? Is that like a progression along the sort of cold exposure?
Oh yes, absolutely. And listen, if you don't make it, just take on one of my. We have a free app. You know, we built an app.
Yeah.
That app is for free, so it has all what you need.
Yeah. What's it called?
I don't know what's called, but it's the Wim Hof method.
Yeah.
.com, and there is an app. I used the app once. I know, together with my son, and I have to say it works. And I took it on. I was listening to myself. I did the breathing together with my voice, together with my son, and we had a great time. But yeah, man, I don't know how I got there. It was my son who activated the app on the phone. So I don't know exactly, but it is for free. And every month we make sure we pay about 10,000 euros a month to embed the app, and it's all for free. So we want everybody to know this, that health is at your choice. That the breathing, the cold exercises endorsed by science are fully there, fully exposed. So there is no confusion about it. It's very clear, very effective, very accessible, and very powerful. It really is. So that's about the cold and the breathing.
Yeah,
and,
let's go to breathing.
Yes, let's go
move to breathing. I mean, before we do, could we just say the cold, if all you do, right, is take a cold shower each day and you do nothing with your breath, right? Even that, I'm guessing, will have some benefit, but the benefit is magnified if you also do the breathing. Is that right?
Absolutely, absolutely. Here comes in the power of the mind. Because once you learn to control your breath, going into the cold shower, you enter into changing, getting a hold on the stress upon the body through holding your breath, to stay on with the breath. And with that, it's the beginning of getting into the stress mechanisms inside the brain.
Wow.
And then the unlocking of the potential to neurologically control the stress mechanisms of your brain is beginning. And it can go very fast. Can go very fast that you learn to control what you could not control in the past, which then created fear instead of confidence. Now you will learn to have confidence because your brain now is able to be entered into the stress mechanisms to activate it whenever you need it. It's like instead of being helpless, suddenly you have a gun in your hand. You are powerful. You are powerful against the stressor coming in. I'm not into war, guys, and I'm not a cowboy. I'm into peace. And bringing peace is bringing a true confidence that you are able to confront yourself with any kind of stressor. That is the way you bring peace to yourself, because you are not on the watch out. Hey, is it going to come? Oh, my work. Oh, this, oh, that. All that you learn to pacify within, to observe. That's what the cold does. And the breathing together exponentially is a stairway to the mind. And that's what we have shown. It's quite mystic. It was all very esoteric before. And now it's gone and become very accessible and effective for people.
Sleep really is the tide that raises all of the other health boats. It's just as you said, it's the superordinate node that if you manipulate it, it's like the Archimedes lever, you pull that, everything else, can start to come into play.
Yeah, you get the sleep better, it affects your brain, it affects your hormones, it affects your genetic expression, it affects all these sort of things that we might be looking for drugs to affect those individual pathways, but you can improve a lot of them by improving your sleep.
Yeah, and it's we think, well, that sounds almost too good, but don't forget, it took Mother Nature 3.6 million years to evolve this necessity of 8 hours of sleep in place, which I should note, by the way, that if you look at the data, back in the 1940s, the average adult was sleeping about 7.9 hours of sleep. Now that number here in the United Kingdom is closer to 6 hours and 30 minutes. In other words, within the space of 100 years, which is a blink of an evolutionary eye, we've lopped off almost 20% of our sleep need. How could that not come with demonstrable health and disease consequence? So I think, there's that component there. But I love what you were saying that, in medicine, we're often, or even in research and pharmaceuticals, we're often trying to sort of manipulate one pathway in one area of the metabolic system, or one aspect of the immune system, or one feature of the cardiovascular system. And, sleep affects all of those. And we can, I'll give you an example. Firstly, we know that if you get a patient and you have them sleeping just 6 hours for 1 week, this is someone, let's say, who is healthy. At the end of that 1 week of short sleep, their blood sugar levels are disrupted so significantly that they would be pre-diabetic, that you would diagnose them as being in a state of pre-diabetic.
Just from sleep deprivation.
Just from sleep deprivation, when you control all of the factors. You can also speak about sleep loss and the cardiovascular system. And all it takes is 1 hour of lost sleep because there is a global experiment that's performed on 1.6 billion people across 70 countries twice a year, and it's called daylight savings time.
Yeah.
And it turns out that when you look at that data, in the spring, when we lose an hour of sleep, we see a subsequent 24% increase in heart attacks as a result.
It's just incredible.
But in the
it?
autumn, when we gain an hour of sleep, we see a 21% reduction in heart attacks.
So the data's there on a global level, isn't it? Just from that.
Is striking, and you can even think, you speak a lot about, the immune system. It's so key for our health.
So tell us, what does sleep do for the immune system?
So firstly, we can look on both sides of the coin. What happens when we don't get enough sleep? Firstly, we know that people who are sleeping 5 hours a night are 4 times more likely to catch a cold than those people who are sleeping 8 hours or more.
Wow.
Striking study, very well controlled study. We also know that it doesn't take 1 week of, short sleep deprivation. 1 night is enough. What we've found is that if you take healthy individuals and then we limit them to just 4 hours of sleep for 1 single night, what we see is a 70% drop in critical anti-cancer fighting immune cells called natural killer cells, which are these wonderful sort of immune assassins that, help decrease our, cancer risk.
Yeah. And help us fight infections.
And fight infection.
Part of our innate immune system.
Exactly. Part of that critical innate immune response. Flip the sort of the side of the coin. And now what we find is that when you get sleep, there is a change in what we call the autonomic nervous system, which is sort of this automatic part of our nervous system. And that automatic nervous system is split into 2 branches. One that is sort of like the accelerator pedal that gets us revved up, triggers the fight or flight response. The other is the brake that sort of calms us down. And when we go into deep sleep, we apply that brake to the nervous system and everything quiets down. Heart rate decreases. Deep sleep is the most wonderful form of natural blood pressure medication that you could ever wish for.
Yeah.
But one of the other things is that we see as that nervous system quiets down, levels of things like cortisol drop down, that stress-related chemical. And it's during that time that the body goes into an immune stimulation mode. And it's where essentially you're going to restock the armament of your immune army so that when you wake up the next day, you can battle and fight infection. What's also fascinating, and I love this data, and this tells you just how critical sleep is to a fighting for our health. If you look at people who become infected, or you actually infect them in the experimental laboratory, let's say with sort of a cold vaccine, or you immediately trigger increased sleepiness and increased amounts of deep sleep. And it turns out that the infection indicates to the immune system that you're under attack, and the immune system will actually signal to the sleep system within the brain, we need more sleep. Sleep is the best battle force that we have right now to combat this assault. And so that's why when you're sick, all you tend to want to do is just curl up in bed and go to sleep. The reason is because your body is trying to sleep you well.
It's an appropriate response to what's going on, right?
Exactly.
So bodies are pretty clever, right?
They are remarkably clever. Again, Mother Nature has figured this out. And so she brings up this thing called sleep, which I would argue is probably like the Swiss Army knife of health. Whatever ailment you are facing, it is more than likely that sleep has a tool in the box to try and help fight it.
That's so key. Whatever ailment you're facing, guys, if you're listening to this, whatever you're suffering from, whether it's a lack of energy on a day-to-day basis, or whether it's that you're worried about your risk of developing a chronic disease such as type 2 diabetes or heart problems as you get older, what Matthew is saying, what Professor Walker is saying is that sleep, improving your quality of sleep, is going to help you with all these different facets. It's going to help reduce your risk. It's going to help increase your energy. It's also going to reduce your risk of actually getting disease in the future, which is just absolutely incredible. I mean, we are going to move on to tips, because I know many of you will be thinking, okay, this is all great. I'm sort of hearing about all these things that sleep does, but how do I get more? So we're going to come to that shortly. But there's so much I want to talk to you about, Matthew. I mean, I think we could easily make this like a full day podcast. I'm that fascinated in this.
I would love to return at some point, should you wish me to.
Yeah, well, 100%. But I think, what you said about medical school training, I think it's very important, because pretty much everything that I put in here, and then the last quarter of the book is on sleep, I'm not convinced that any of that came from my medical school training. So that was all self-taught from, spending hours on PubMed, reading research, going to conferences, trying to learn more because I wanted to help my patients more. And I thought, I need to know more about this so I can actually do my patients, and give them a better service. So you're saying that, maybe medical students may get maybe 2 hours or so, and you'd love to sort of try and help that and get, maybe a sleep curriculum into medical schools. And this really, I think one of the reasons we get on so well is there's so much synergy in our viewpoint in terms of how we think this needs to change. So what I've done over the past 6 months is develop a brand new course with a colleague of mine, Dr. Panja, called Prescribing Lifestyle Medicine. And it's a one-day masterclass to teach healthcare professionals, but primarily doctors, on the basics of, lifestyle medicine, if you will, as a term. So we go into sleep and we teach this framework where they can simply apply these 4 pillars with their patients to start to actually implement lifestyle medicine. I'd love to maybe collaborate with you and show you the slides.
I'd love to. And I've got, I teach a whole course at the University of California, Berkeley, the science of sleep. So I've got lots of slides. I'd love to just share and do whatever I could to try and help sort of perpetuate that movement that you've got going. It's wonderful. That's exactly what we need.
Yeah, and then maybe we can talk about how we get that into medical schools. And
yeah, I was going to actually ask you, how could we, even collectively, think about trying to, approach sort of medicine here in the United Kingdom and see if we could.
Well, we'll talk about that off air from the podcast, because I think that could be a great collaboration. Okay, Matthew, I know you're short on time, and again, we could just go on for so long. I was going to ask you about sleep and stress, but I think, guys, for those of you listening to this, I cover that in quite a bit of detail, I think, with you on my chat that's on my Facebook page, which is facebook.com/Dr. Chatterjee. So, guys, you can actually check it out there. But everything that Matthew and I talk about, including that Lancet paper that he mentioned, is going to be in the show notes, which is going to be at drchatterjee.com/why we sleep. There's going to be links there to everything Matthew talks about, some of Matthew's articles, his book, all kinds of things. So guys, do check that out after the podcast, and you can do a bit of further reading on those topics that interest you. So yeah, where to go to next? I mean, one thing that we do talk about on that course, and I think we've not spoken about this yet, is about sleep and its role in mental health. And, what's interesting, you mentioned bi-directional relationships before, and how a lack of sleep can increase our risk of problems, but also sleep can be a treatment as well for various things. And I wonder if you could talk about that in relation to mental health problems such as anxiety and depression, and maybe from then just move briefly onto Alzheimer's if possible.
Yeah. So we've done a lot of work in this area of sort of sleep and mental health. I think the first point to note is that we have not been able to discover a single psychiatric condition in which sleep is normal.
Wow.
And I think sleep has a profound story to tell in our understanding, in our treatment, maybe even ultimately at some point our prevention of grave mental illness. And I don't say that flippantly. Firstly, we've done some work where you can take healthy individuals and you can deprive them of sleep for a single night. And then you place them inside an MRI scanner and you look at how their brain has changed. And what we find is that these deep emotional brain centers erupt when you're sleep deprived. You become a lot more emotionally reactive, impulsive. There's a deep brain center called the amygdala, which is one of the centerpiece regions for the generation of strong emotions. That part of the brain is up to 60% more reactive when you're sleep deprived relative to when you've had a good, solid night of sleep. And we've also found
That's a huge amount.
It's a 60%. It's very difficult to usually see that type of a change in the brain without some kind of pathology or drug.
And I think
deprivation will do it.
On an intuitive level, most people recognize that when they haven't slept well, they're just a little bit more reacted to things. That email from their boss, for example, can be easily misinterpreted. They annoyed at me. You suddenly start to see things that aren't there. And I've just, as I mentioned this before, I've just completed my second book called The Stress Solution, which is going to come out in January, and I cover a little bit of this that you're talking about in that to really try and show people that, lack of sleep is a stress on our body, and 60%, that's incredible.
Change in the brain, yeah. And I think it really comes, you're absolutely right. Many of us have a sense that, I just snapped ... Those are the words that usually follow a bad night of sleep, or when you've not got enough sleep. And we know it all the way down sort of the age chain. You think about a parent holding a child, the child is crying, and they look at you and they say, well, they just didn't sleep well last night. As if there's some universal knowledge that bad sleep the night before equals bad mood and emotion reactivity the next day. And it doesn't stop in infancy or childhood or adolescence. It's true when we are adults as well. And we've seen this data. What I think is concerning is that neurological signature that we discovered in that study is not dissimilar to numerous psychiatric conditions. And in fact, we're now finding significant links between sleep disruption and depression, anxiety, including PTSD, schizophrenia, and most recently and tragically, suicide as well. In fact, a short sleep duration is usually predictive of either suicidal ideation, suicidal thoughts, suicide attempts, and tragically, suicide completion. So I think the scope through which sleep is impacting mental health disease, I think, is considerable. We used to think in psychiatry that the psychiatric disease was perhaps causing the sleep disruption. I think now we've been forced to change our minds. It's not as though it's completely in the opposite direction. It's not that every psychiatric condition is a sleep disorder. That's not true either. But is it a two-way street? I think that that's probably more tenable. In fact, is the dominant flow of traffic perhaps more in one direction than the other? I think that's also reasonable to assume on the basis of the data right now as well. So I think it's, there's clearly an intimate relationship between our mental health and our sleep health.
Matthew, these, the implications of what you just said, I think, are so profound. We've got to accept in the 21st century, not only do we not prioritize sleep enough, we're a chronically sleep-deprived society. We're now going through a mental health epidemic. Mind, the charity here in the UK, say that about 1 in 4 people in the UK now in any given year are going to be diagnosed with a mental health problem. Right, now that's incredible. And when you hear about that research, we think chronically sleep-deprived society, mental health problems on the rise. Yes, there are other factors. Okay, I don't think you
both of us agree on that. Yeah,
we're not trying to say it's all to do with sleep, but what we are trying to say is that sleep is a critical part of the equation and one that we can no longer afford to ignore. So I find that research fascinating, and it makes me think as a doctor. You've mentioned already type 2 diabetes, heart disease, mental health problems such as depression and anxiety. I know. At our previous discussion, again, guys, I'd point you to that Facebook discussion because we won't have time to go into this today, but we will when I get you back on the podcast. On our Facebook discussion, we did go into Alzheimer's and how, sleep deprivation you feel may be causative now, or one of the causative factors that causes Alzheimer's disease.
That's right.
I'm thinking, well, I often say this when I'm teaching doctors, why are we not bringing up sleep quality with pretty much every single patient that walks in through our door?
And you could imagine the cost savings to, our economy. In fact, the Rand Corporation recently did a survey, the enormous cost of sleep deprivation throughout a number of developed nations. What they found was that a lack of sleep costs most nations about 2% of their GDP. So here in the United Kingdom, that's £30 billion of lost economic value caused by insufficient sleep. In the United States, it was $411 billion. In Japan, it was $138 billion. In other words, if you solve the sleep loss epidemic, imagine you could almost double the budget for education, or you could perhaps even halve the healthcare deficit. Theresa May just this week, as we're speaking here, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, described a £20 billion injection of funds into the national healthcare system. And there's uproar about where that money is going to come from.
Sure.
Well, if we just simply prioritized and solved the sleep epidemic, the sleep loss epidemic, we could cover that and still have 10 billion pounds left over.
Yeah, I know, and this podcast doesn't sound to be too political, but I would say that I find a lot of the messaging around the NHS and public very short-sighted. It's about pumping more money in to fix downstream issues, whereas we've got to look at prioritising sleep as a society, whether it's the lighting that's used in hospitals when patients are trying to recover from illness, which isn't very helpful a lot of the time, whether it's teaching our children about it and encouraging good habits, at school, but also as parents with our kids, really ingraining. And I think, we've not really got into technology today and how the overuse of technology can potentially be problematic for sleep. I agree. Sleep, it's such a simple lever to turn. It's also, well, we'll come into tips in just a second, but, so many health inequalities are there from people from different socioeconomic groups. We know in the UK that, you can have as much of a 10-year difference in your life expectancy depending on where you live. One thing I like about a focus on sleep, and I appreciate that there are many pressures in deprived communities, financial stresses, maybe a lot of shift work, maybe working multiple jobs.
That's
so
right.
I absolutely understand and recognise that there are significant issues that we have to overcome. But a lot of the recommendations that we're now going to talk about, that I cover in my book and you cover in detail in your book, most of the recommendations to help people to, get more quality sleep are free of charge.
Yeah, I often say that I think sleep is perhaps the most democratically freely available healthcare system for everyone around the world. Now, that's a bit of a glib statement on the basis of exactly what you just said, I think about, and the data is quite frightening. We've been looking at this too, at sort of low socioeconomic status communities, and there what you'd see is just what you described, higher general social stress that impairs sleep, usually working multiple different jobs, split shifts, working the night work. Often people in those communities are working in the service industry. That usually means that you're either up very early or you're staying in work very late, all of which comprise, factors that work against sleep. So I want to be really appreciative of that.
Yeah, me too.
But still, I think, the tips that we can do right now to start sleeping better every night should be applicable and for the most part utilized by just about everyone, as long as you don't have a sleep disorder.
Well, Matthew, normally I end the podcast off by asking people for 4 key tips that people can put into practice immediately, but we don't have to limit it to 4. I want this podcast to inspire people to not only take sleep seriously, but to give them some practical help. So immediately after listening to this, I can put the headphones down and go, right, I'm going to do what Professor Walker's asked me to do. I'm going to try these 5 things today. In your experience, and you've been interviewed all around the world now to do with your book, what are those common things that people aren't doing that they could do to help improve their sleep?
Yeah, so there's probably maybe 5 things that people can do right now to get better sleep. The first is regularity. Going to bed at the same time and waking up at the same time, no matter what. Even if you've had a bad night of sleep, still try to wake up at the same time. Just understand it's going to be a tough next day, and then get to bed at the same time that following night, and you'll have a good night of sleep. You'll sort of sleep a little bit more soundly that night. Even if it's the weekday or the weekend, don't do what we call social jet lag, which is sort of where you sort of sleep too late at the weekend, and then on Sunday night you've got to drag your body clock all the way back and try and force it to sleep at a time when you haven't been sleeping before. That's torture. Regularity is key. The second thing is temperature. We've spoken a little bit about that, but keep your bedroom cool. Probably around about 18 degrees Celsius, which is colder than most people think. But cooling the room down takes your body into that right sort of thermal space for good sleep. It cools it down. Darkness, we've spoken about too, but we are, I think, a dark deprived society in this modern era. And you need darkness at night to allow the release of a hormone called melatonin, which helps time the healthy onset of your sleep. So yes, it's to do with blue light sort of emitting devices, screens, phones. Those are things that you should try and stay away from in the last hour before bed. But it's not just that. It's also overhead lighting. We don't need to be bathed in electric light all night. In the last hour before bed, just try turning half of the lights off in your flat or in your home. You'd be surprised at how soporific and sleepy you become when you're shrouded in darkness. So that's the third thing. The fourth thing is, I would say, walk it out. And what I mean by that is, don't stay in bed if you've been awake for 20 or 25 minutes, either trying to fall asleep or you've woken up and you're trying to get back to sleep. The reason is because your brain is this wonderfully associative device, and it will start to very quickly learn that being in bed is about being awake rather than asleep. So what you need to do is, after about 25 minutes, just relax, understand that sleep is not quite here yet, go to a different room, in dim light, read a book or listen to a podcast, but don't check email, don't eat, because it trains your brain to expect that in the middle of the night. Only return to bed when you are very sleepy. And that way your brain will start to relearn the association that your bedroom is the place of sleep rather than the place of
I think
wake.
that's a really important tip, Matthew, that, I know even from our first conversation on Facebook, but, whenever I talk about sleep, people can often get really wound up about this and say, I'm doing all those things, I can't sleep. And they've really just, without trying to, their brain has just got into this position where it's been trained not to sleep. It's been trained to not associate the bedroom with sleep. Or, so many people I see, when I hear about on social media, are doing work emails right up to the moment they fall asleep. And we mentioned children before, and I often say, children need a bedtime routine. We know that. Right? Why as adults do we think we're any different?
We should, and you're absolutely right. We've turned the bed in this day and age often, into a kitchen. We've turned it into an office. We've turned it into a cinema. We do all of these things typically on the bed, which then it does impact the brain's association. It gets quite confused about what this thing called the bed is all about. So I think that's a very helpful tip. And try not to get too anxious if you're sort of falling asleep. I know that probably a lot of what I've been telling people will make you feel anxious if you're not being able to get the sleep that you need, but try not to worry about it. Everyone has a bad night of sleep. Just get up, understand that you're going to be awake for a little bit longer, and then go back to bed, and you will start to relearn that association. And in fact, a lot of people and patients will say to me, well, I've been falling asleep on the settee watching television, and then I get into bed and I'm wide awake and I don't know why. And again, it's because of this association that you've learned with the bed. The final two things, one of which we've mentioned, is what you intake into your body, caffeine and alcohol. We've spoken about caffeine, but I'll speak about alcohol quickly. Many people use alcohol as a sleep aid, and it is anything but an assistant to sleep. Alcohol is a class of drugs that we call the sedatives, and sedation is not sleep. Unfortunately,
sedation is not sleep.
It's very different. So what you're doing when you have a nightcap or you use alcohol to try and get to sleep, and many people do, understandably so, they mistake one for the other. You're just knocking your cortex out. You're not in natural sleep. The two other problems with alcohol and sleep: firstly, alcohol will fragment your sleep. So if I were to record someone's sleep in the laboratory after they've had a couple of drinks, their sleep is littered with all of these awakenings throughout the night. Now, you tend not to remember waking up, but the next day you feel, again, unrefreshed. You don't feel sort of bright and alert or restored by your sleep. But you don't remember waking up, so you don't link it to the alcohol. But alcohol is bad at fragmenting your sleep, produces poor quality. The final thing alcohol is good at doing is blocking your dream sleep or your REM sleep. And we know, to come back to our conversation, REM sleep is critical for emotional first aid. REM sleep provides overnight therapy. It's a form of emotional convalescence, and alcohol will block that REM sleep quite viciously. So those would be the 5 tips, I think, for better sleep.
Yeah, Matthew, thanks. I love that. Just to say on alcohol, is it dose dependent? So, for example, some people say, well, I'm okay with 1 glass of wine, but 2 or 3 glasses is going to fragment my sleep. Can you comment on the dosage there, or would you advise people who are struggling with sleep to knock it on its head, basically?
I know, and it's so hard for me to answer this, and this is the reason, one of the many reasons why I'm such a deeply unpopular person. But
I don't think that's fair to say, but
Firstly, I don't want to sound puritanical. Life is to be lived to a degree. And all of these things that we're discussing, we're trying to speak about the extremes. But I also want to empower people with the knowledge. I'm not here to tell you necessarily what you should or you shouldn't do. I just want to give you the scientific facts, and then you can make the choice. I would say, unfortunately, that even just one glass of alcohol in the evening, we can see that, we can measure that.
You can measure that in your lab. You can see that you're not getting the same deep level of restorative sleep, even with one drink.
Even with one drink. So I know it's hard, but now, everyone, should, have a social life and sort of, enjoy a drink now and again. I think the best advice would be this. If you're going to bed feeling tipsy, you probably have had too much alcohol in terms of sleep impairment.
Well, I think, I so resonate with it, with so much of what you've just said, which is, this podcast, what I do, what you do, it's not about telling people what to do. I've got no interest of telling someone what they should do. I have no right to tell someone what they should do with their lives. Yeah. What I think we're trying to do is to educate people, inspire them, empower them to understand what lifestyle choices they're making and how that could impact their health. And I always draw the analogy with going out, having a few drinks with your mates on a Friday night. People know intuitively that if I go out for a drink on a Friday night and have 3 or 4 pints, let's say, you know what, my Saturday morning might be a bit of a write-off. I may not be functioning as well as I might want to. But you're going into that with that knowledge. You're saying, I know the effect alcohol has on me, but I'm going to get so much enjoyment out of my night out tonight that I'm willing to put up with the consequences. What I think we're both trying to say is, guys, we just want to empower you. We want to help you understand the impact that caffeine might be having on your sleep, that alcohol might be having on your sleep, that the fact that you're on your work emails before you go to bed might be having on your sleep. Do with that information what you will. That's how I would put it.
I so agree, because I think, a lot of, what you speak about in your book, which is, far more wide ranging than mine, because I just take one of the things, you go after 4 of the key pillars, which is so much more impressive. I think it says so much about the difference between me and you, Rangan. But
you're a researcher. I'm a clinician, right? There's a big difference, right?
There is, but I still think it's a heroic thing. But what I would say, I think, is that yes, a lot of people are aware of some of these things, like it's good to be physically active, I should try and stay away from drinking too much alcohol. But I also think that there's a lot of what we discuss, I hope in both books, that is perhaps knowledge that people aren't aware of.
Yeah.
And if only that they were aware of it, they would actually want to do something different. That's the sort of the case that I'm really passionate about, is that people, as long as you know the information and you choose to do otherwise, no problem at all. A lot of people just are either misinformed or entirely, when it comes to sleep, uninformed. That's the goal.
That is the goal, and it's really about, it's that empowerment piece. And this is one thing I just want to end on, is just to say, guys, look, it may not be that you can just change one thing and suddenly have a great night's sleep. You might have to change 3 or 4 things together. That's certainly my experience. It's like, Matthew, you're a researcher, so a lot, you'll do research and showing what caffeine does, on showing what alcohol does. But I would say, as a clinician, use that research, but maybe you might have to try a few things. Like you might try, for example, 1 week with no caffeine and no alcohol and see how you sleep, because then you can be empowered to decide what you're going to do after that. Are you going to go back? Or maybe then, I always try and get people sleeping as well as they've ever slept. Then they can start reintroducing some of these lifestyle things that they want, and they can say, oh, wow, that's interesting. I felt great last week, but now when I have a 2 p.m. coffee, you know what, I'm not quite as good. Okay, that's going to teach me now that I'm going to knock it a bit earlier in the day, because I think ultimately nobody's going to follow your advice or my advice simply because we told them to. I think it's only when they start to feel the difference themselves, they go, wow, I kind of like feeling good.
Yeah, and I think, I love your point about just trying to give it time too. Sleep and starting to change your sleep and seeing the effects of getting better sleep. It's a little bit like exercise at the gym. You're not going to go to the gym one day and wake up looking like Arnold Schwarzenegger. It just takes some time, but if you commit to it, you will see gradual change. And it's the same thing with sleep as well. But I also think, I love the idea of you putting sleep in that bedrock place and then starting to introduce the other factors, what's lovely is that many of them will actually fall in place when sleep is stabilized. And I'll give you a good example of diet. We know that without sufficient sleep, two critical appetite hormones go in opposite bad directions. One of those hormones is called leptin, which is a hormone that sort of signals to your body you're full, you don't want to eat anymore. The other hormone is called ghrelin, which does the opposite. It says you're not satisfied with your food, you want to eat more. And despite leptin and ghrelin sounding like two hobbits, they are actually real hormones. What's interesting is that when you sleep deprive people, or even just limit them to maybe just like 5 or 6 hours of sleep for a week, levels of leptin, which say you're full, don't eat more, they drop down. Levels of ghrelin that ramp up your hunger and say, I've just eaten a big meal, but I'm not satisfied, I want to eat more. That hormone skyrockets when you're underslept. So no wonder people who are sleeping just 5 to 6 hours a night will actually eat on average somewhere between 200 to 300 extra calories every single day.
Yeah,
so you can solve sleep and you will actually start to not want to eat as much.
Yeah, and this is why a part of weight loss is to sleep better. As a doctor, I see a lot of people who are starting to disengage with life. People with mental health problems, people who really struggle, with day-to-day things, day-to-day activities. And, in the book, you beautifully go through a lot of the research around this, about how being sedentary in itself will make you low and depressed. And I think there's a statistic, if I remember it right, that the amount of steps you need to take on a daily basis in order to not get anxious or depressed, or something like this, is 5,649.
Yeah, so let me explain what this study is. So this was a study that took people who were a little bit more active than your average American, not like super exercisers. I think they were averaging something like 9,000 steps a day when they started the study. And then they asked them to reduce their daily step count to what is typical for the average American, so around 5,000. And to not exercise. So like if you have the chance to exercise on purpose, don't. And in this study, after about a week of reducing your activity count to the average American, they actually only got to about whatever that number was you said. It was just over 5,000. 88% of people were reporting symptoms of depression. Nearly everyone had less energy, more anxiety, more stress. They reported a 31% decrease in meaning in life. And so, the way that I take that study, and there are other studies showing this too. So
can I just clarify? So you're saying these are active people,
relatively active people.
Okay, so they're roughly getting 9,000 steps a day. When they go down to around 5,500,
which is actually not just the American average, that's pretty much the worldwide average.
So they go down, and you're saying there was a stat, I think you just mentioned, 88% of them are feeling depressed.
Yes. And they're reporting a decrease in meaning in life and satisfaction with life.
And so this is fundamentally exactly what you're talking about. Movement is engaging with life. Stop moving and you start to disengage with life.
So I do think that study suggests it's possible that the lifestyle that is becoming more prevalent around the world is actually inducing depression and a decrease in satisfaction in life. I mean, we can talk about why, but there are many reasons that when you become less active, you're changing your metabolism, you're changing your brain chemistry, and you're changing your mood in such profound ways that, some people think there's a very large incidence of depression that is caused simply from being sedentary. That's not always going to be the cause, and movement won't always be the cure. But a certain amount of suffering in society may actually be directly caused by the fact that people are living such sedentary lives.
Yeah, I spoke to the researcher, Brendan Stubbs.
Yes, I love his work.
Yeah, I think it came out a few weeks ago. People loved it because he spoke about a lot of the research on movement and depression. Yeah. And a lack of movement can actually start to make some people, and again, none of us are trying to say it covers everything, but for some people it's going to certainly make a difference. And I think we kind of intuitively know that. If anyone's got kids, you will know this feeling. Like if in the UK, certainly if it's raining all weekends and the kids are inside and they start to play up and their mood goes off, simply, 10 minutes outside in the garden in the rain, and they're like different people.
But it's also how it changes your brain. So one of the things I write about in the book, I actually did some like self-diagnosis. So I found a lot of research suggesting that there are genetic variants that predispose you both to depression and anxiety, as well as predispose you to experiencing the antidepressant effects of movement. So you could basically have genetic risk factors for mental health challenges that make you especially susceptible to the mental health benefits of exercise. So, one study was looking at this particular SNP, this particular genetic variant, that if you have it, you're something like 3 times more likely to experience depression and suicidal thinking. But if you exercise for 30 minutes a day, it almost completely erases that risk. And so I found a whole bunch of these genetic variants, and I did my 23andMe test, hacked my raw data because my husband is a medical scientist and he helped me out with this. And I have every single genetic variant that is associated with both the increased risk and the increased mental health benefit. And so I feel like sometimes when we talk about how exercise can be an antidepressant, yeah, of course it's true that most people feel better when they exercise, but also it's the case that you can be like me and be born with a temperament and this vulnerability to experience mental health challenges, and exercise can change the function of your brain, can change even the structure of your brain in ways that make you more resilient. And if you are going through an episode of depression, that can help you recover more quickly, and that even enhances your brain's ability to respond positively to things like antidepressant medication or psychotherapy. We know that exercise, it's like an additive, it's like a catalyst that increases your brain plasticity for anything that's good for you, whether it's a drug that you're taking for your mental health or a therapist that you're seeing. And so I feel like that's at a very deep level, exercise is good for mental health. And one of the reasons I like to talk about this is because, for people who have that vulnerability or have that experience, when you're in it, you don't want to move. When you're in it, your brain, it's such like almost a betrayal. If you're in the middle of a depressive episode or grief, your brain will not give you the immediate reward. And so here we can be talking about an endorphin rush or the feel better effect. But if you're actually in a depressive episode or you're grieving, it is very possible that your brain has forgotten how to give you an endorphin rush from movement. And what I want so much for people to know is that that is true. And also, movement is one of the only things you can do that helps your brain remember how to experience reward and hope. And sometimes you have to get through that part of the process where you are moving even though you don't want to, and even though you're like, brain, you were supposed to give me an endorphin rush and I barely got through it. And to know that exercise has such a profound impact on your brain in the long term, that if you can get through that, your experience changes.
You mentioned that genetic susceptibility and that you had all of them when you looked at the data.
Which didn't surprise me. I told my parents that, and my mom was like, not surprised.
Yeah, but
Yes.
what's interesting for me is that you are someone who has had this very passionate relationship with movement, it sounds like your entire life.
Yeah.
Now, I'm interested when that started, but also I'm interested as to now knowing that genetic data, do you think back on reflection that you figured out at a young age, when
yes.
I move, I feel better, and when I don't, I don't feel good, and therefore that has shaped your behaviors for the rest of your life, basically.
Yes. So I'm sure now, if I were growing up now and I was the child I was then, somebody would have thought to like send me to therapy. But growing up, I was born in the 70s, growing up, late 70s, 80s, kids weren't going to therapy, at least not where I lived. Nobody was being prescribed mental health drugs. So it was sort of left to me to figure out what to do with a temperament. I mean, from the time I was out of the womb, I was basically scared, anxious, fearful. There was nothing to explain it except this is how my brain worked from the time I was born. And also, I was not an athlete. So one thing I've been saying lately, which is surprising people who know me now, I actually was put in remedial gym class because I was so uncoordinated and slow. There were like 2 of us who were pulled out of our normal class because we just couldn't keep up. We couldn't, I can't catch a ball. It was humiliating actually at the time. Yeah. And when I was 7 or 8, there was this wave of aerobics and calisthenics, and I discovered moving at home because my mom would go to these garage sales and buy workout tapes and never do them. She was like, oh, I'm going to become an exerciser. And she never did. But we would have these VHS tapes at home. And so I started doing calisthenics and aerobics at home. And it was a totally different form of movement. So nobody was throwing things at me. Nobody was timing how fast I could go. It was me keeping beat with music and other people's bodies. And like I fell in love with jazzercise. And it was the first time I didn't feel like my body was this like embarrassing burden that I was dragging around, unable to do the things that other kids could do. And then over like years, started when I was 7 or 8, realizing how much it helped me deal with stress and anxiety. Yeah. But I needed to find the movement that I could do too. And like, we're not all natural born runners. We're not all natural born athletes. But I do believe that there's something in everyone that can be captured, tapped into by some form of movement.
There's quite a few things, Kelly, I want to pick up on there. You mentioned something that was quite humiliating. So at a young age, I'm just trying to imagine, you're the kids who, let's say, you're not getting picked for the team because you're always the last one to get picked, or you're saying that you and somebody else got pulled out of class because you're not coordinated enough to continue with the rest of your peers. That is torture at that age, to feel. And I guess what I'm getting at is there a difference between men and women in this? We've already mentioned the societal narrative around movement and how, if you can't do what your peers can do and you feel humiliated and you're not part of that group, you might change your relationship with movement for the rest of your life.
There is research on this now. So the research now is looking at, people like our age and older, many of whom had traumatic experiences in gym class or PE. I don't know what it's like in the UK now, but in the US, actually, it's not even required. There are schools now where you don't necessarily have to even take gym or PE.
So that you're not humiliated?
No, just because there's not funding. It's like we don't have art and music class everywhere also now. But I think there's a big shift right now in trying to create less humiliating and traumatizing experiences, because this research shows that if you were picked last, if you have a memory of being shamed because of your body or any other reason that you didn't fit in, there's lots of reasons that kids have been humiliated in sports or gym classes, that it makes you want to avoid movement and exercise for the rest of your life.
So based on that, if you were to give advice to schools, there's a lot of schools, head teachers and teachers who listen to this podcast. Based upon that research then, have you got any advice for them in terms of how they should frame movement and talk about it and manage it at schools? Because you don't want to shape these kids the rest of their life. You don't want to alter their relationship with movement negatively if you can help it.
I mean, and there are a lot of people doing this work, by the way, I should say. A lot of people trying to improve that gym class experience. One thing is autonomy, that people should have choices to identify movements that help them, reduce stress and feel better and connect with others. The most positive experiences I ever had in gym class was when we were given permission to just walk around and talk to our friends. I got more activity doing that than when I was hiding on a field being like, cover me, I hope the ball doesn't come to me because I don't know how to play the sport and I don't want to get hurt. A weightlifting circuit, to be able to do it on your own and choose what you do and how you do it. So to give people a sense of autonomy and to allow people to connect. And the other positive experience I had, for whatever reason, one year, my last year in high school, the gym class instructors decided to allow you to choose into what they called competitive or non-competitive. And we were literally put in different rooms. They put the binders up to close the rooms. And if you opted into non-competitive, everyone was agreeing, we all aren't any good at this and we don't care and we're going to find a way to make it fun. And I realized that I could hit a volleyball for the first time in my life because I wasn't hiding in the back with the competitive players being like, don't let her touch the ball, she's going to drop it. And it was such an amazing experience because none of us cared. And so we were able to play in a different way. So I just think giving people choice, letting people opt into, are you the athlete who wants to use this time to compete and get better and train? Or do you want to just have fun with your friends? Or do you want to be by yourself? Could you let kids listen to music on their headphones and strength train and have that time for themselves? Have it look more like what adults get to do when they choose their own movement.
The reason I'm asking about men and women is because there is, I can't remember the exact name. I think the BBC in the UK have a movement like This Girl Can.
Oh, yes, I've seen that.
Yeah, there's some videos. So I
think Australia has that too.
Yeah, it's an awareness. And again, I don't know the exact roots of this. So my interpretation of this is that there is a lot of people saying that girls as they get older don't particularly, and this is a gross generalization, are maybe too self-conscious to move. They're not moving enough. And it's a movement to try and encourage more girls, more women to get moving. Yeah. Now, I think they're targeting this at women because it seems to be more of an issue with women than guys. Has any of your research come across anything like that? And do you have any views on why that might be?
So, and this, you especially see this during adolescence and young adulthood when women experience their bodies being objectified so much for the first time. I think of one of my friend's daughters who stopped going for a run. She loved running, and all of a sudden she hit adolescence and she started getting catcalls and she didn't feel safe and she stopped running. Yeah. So I think that part of it is suddenly you realize that everyone has an opinion about your body. You go to the gym and people will, and even praise can feel quite threatening and unwanted, or you'll get negative comments from people. And that sense of suddenly your body is an object that everyone is evaluating is, I think, one of the things that keeps women from participating in all sorts of activities. There definitely is a cultural movement, though, for women to embrace their strength, embrace their power, embrace their inner athlete or dancer, and to move in any way that feels good. And I think that one of the things I often will talk to fitness professionals about is how important it is to design environments and communities so that if you're walking in for the first time, you understand that you are welcomed and celebrated and not immediately objectified by let's take your before picture, or, let's take your measurements, or the kind of things that can put people in that mindset of, oh, right, my body is an object that's being evaluated, as opposed to this is an opportunity to experience my own strength.
Yeah. I guess the more we talk and the more I think about what you're saying, it's very hard not to shake off this idea that ultimately movement is very personal. Mm-hmm. And we cannot be, and it's not ideal to be prescribing the same form of movement to everyone, that ultimately we've all got to figure out that, yes, it's a fundamental human quality, not quality is the wrong word. It is what it means to be human, is to move, right? And therefore, if we haven't found that type of movement yet that we love, maybe we need to go on that search for that type of movement that we love.
And trust that it could actually be meaningful. I feel like so often people look for the most convenient form of exercise. Like, I think there's a treadmill somewhere in my office building and I'll go and put in my time. But I sometimes ask people, if someone were to send you a video, on YouTube, what's the video of movement that you would actually watch and be inspired by? Do you want to see people run an obstacle course? Do you want to see people cross a finish line? Do you want to watch that choreography video? What is it that lights you up when you see other people do it? And maybe even there's a voice in your head that says, I could never do that. Yeah. That's the activity to move toward, because it can change how you feel about yourself and what you believe is possible for your future. And again, to experiment and to listen to your direct feedback and to follow any thread of joy. I often will tell people who come to my classes for the first time, if you have a moment in this class where you were like, oh, I see what this could be, then this class is for you, and come back. Because any movement form, this was so great. Movement is it's a mastery and growth experience. We will pretty much always get better at it, and we will always enjoy it more the more we do it.
You mentioned that people often do the kind of movements that they just have access to. So there's a treadmill in the block, and it's going, put in my time. Now, isn't that an interesting phrase, put in my time? Because when I'm traveling, I don't really go to gyms much. It's just, I don't really have time, and I've found ways to move my body that doesn't require me to go to a gym. But sometimes I'm in hotels, and I will, if I'm up early, I'll go to the hotel gym just to see what's going on and maybe lift some weights or do something. And it's very interesting. You often see people in there who they look as though they're trying to block out the fact that they're moving. It looks as though this is a torturous process for me. Someone's told me, or I feel I have to be on this treadmill for an hour. So I'm going to do everything I can to numb that experience, whether it's read the newspaper, watch the news, watch Netflix. Now, look, I am not being critical here. I'm just saying what I observe. And I guess sometimes we feel we need to block out the movements that, we feel we have to move, but we hate it, so we block it out. Now, I'm wondering, is there any research to show that there's a difference? Let's say you're on the treadmill and you're engaged with that, and you're feeling, how you feel, your limbs are moving, and how, what's going on in your brain, and you're sort of processing your emotions, versus blocking it off completely, so you're numbing that experience. Does that movement do something different from the body in those two different examples?
Yeah. So if you are so there's such a thing as positive dissociation during exercise. And for some people, it's actually really important. So one of the things we know is that your brain changes when you go from being inactive to active, that it changes in ways that makes movement not only easier, but more pleasurable. So when people first start to exercise, it often is an aversive experience. It doesn't stay that way for most people, but maybe you have to go 6 weeks of doing regular activity for your brain to start to really reward you for it. So in that time, positive dissociation can be really helpful. That's different than like watching the news and getting angry or scrolling through and answering emails. That's where something like music can come into play, or watching something really exciting on Netflix. And there's research suggesting that if you can combine movement with something you love that is engaging, that it can actually help you stick to movement, have a more positive memory of it. But ultimately, if you can experience a state of flow in movement, that's more rewarding for most people. And it can take some time to find that. But that requires paying some attention to what you're feeling in your body, using it as information to guide your effort, enjoying sensations of feedback from your muscles and your joints and your heart that tell you, I'm alive and I'm doing this, and this is how it feels to lift something heavy or to exert myself in this way. And often that's how you found the right workout for you, where you can find a flow in it, where you don't feel like you need to distract yourself from it.
Yeah.
And you can find a flow in anything. It can be, it's not like you can only find it in some traditionally meditative experience like yoga or Tai Chi. People find their flow in all sorts of movement forms. There's so much of it that's personality, and so much about what your body kind of was built for. I talked to a lot of people who told me they thought they hated exercise until they found, and then fill in the blank. And maybe it was rowing or swimming. Like some people need to get in the water and they have a totally different experience of movement in their bodies. Yeah. Some people needed to get outdoors. And because of the way that nature changes your brain activity and your mood, suddenly they can find a flow walking or jogging outdoors that they could never find on a treadmill. And again, for me, it's music. Anything can become enjoyable if I have the right playlist.
We've used the terms movement and exercise a lot during this conversation so far. Can we use those terms interchangeably, or are they actually different things?
They do mean different things technically. I love the word exercise. I'm not scared of it. So movement is using your body to engage with life. It's almost everything, right? We talked about it. Me talking right now is technically movement. Exercise is often defined as moving your body for the purpose of the activity that you're doing. I am running because I want to run, not because someone is chasing me. I am dancing because I want to dance, not because someone is paying me to perform on a stage, right? I'm lifting heavy things because I want to lift heavy things, not because I'm moving from one apartment to another and I have to lift heavy things. That's what exercise is. It's movement that you are choosing to do for its own sake because of its meaning, its pleasure, or its benefits to you. So I think too many people define exercise as forcing yourself to do movement you don't want to do.
Yeah.
And that's not what it is.
Yeah, by that definition, exercise is not a helpful term, but by your definition, it can be a very helpful term.
Yeah.
Do different forms of movement do different things? And what I mean by that is we've got in the common vernacular a term, the runner's high, right? So I know you've written about this. I'd love to expand a bit on what that runner's high is and why everyone might not feel it. But also, I do like to run. but I also sometimes like to lift heavy weights. And I know if I have done a heavy deadlift, and as I'm walking out of the gym, like, I don't know, you feel strong, you feel powerful, you feel like you feel like a different person walking out than the person you felt like walking in. So what is going on there? What is changing in your body? What is the runner's high? What are these, endorphins that everyone talks about? Because as I read your book, Kelly, I more and more feel that reducing movement down to simply being about an endorphin high is far too simplistic.
So different forms of movement can affect your mood in two different ways. You will get different changes in your brain chemistry based on what you're doing. And also, every movement form has its own qualities. So you talked about feeling strong or powerful or confident. And every movement form will bring something else out in you. And so part of how movement makes you feel is what it is that it asks you to express. Are you expressing your determination, your playfulness and creativity, your ability to cooperate with others? But the other part is actually different movement forms will lead to different changes in what's happening in your brain. So you mentioned the runner's high. I call it a persistence high, because it's a common effect in your brain when you get your heart rate up a little bit and you're using your muscles to use energy for about 20 minutes at a moderate intensity. And it really is about continuous movement rather than about running specifically. It's just that running, because it's so continuous, jogging actually is even a better way to get a runner's high than running. It basically tells your brain, we're doing this, and so I need a payoff to help me continue doing it. And you can get this basic high from anything that puts your body in motion and you're willing to commit to it for about 20 minutes. And it's driven, it seems to be driven not mostly by endorphins. To get a true endorphin rush from movement, you typically need to add one of three things: more intensity, other people, or music. And if you add those, you can get an endorphin rush from pretty much any type of movement. But the classic runner's high is fueled by endocannabinoids, which as a brain chemical is different than endorphins in a way that I think is really interesting. So we know that endorphins tend to basically block pain and create euphoria, which is why, by the way, with the right playlist or when you're moving with other people, that can really make you feel euphoric, because that will really give you an endorphin rush, or pushing yourself to fatigue. But endocannabinoids, what they do is whatever is going on in your brain that we would think of as unpleasant, it starts to dampen it down. So endocannabinoids are basically, they modulate other systems of the brain. So if you've got pain, physical pain, if you've got stress, anxiety, anger, higher levels of endocannabinoids are basically going to calm those things down in your brain. And endocannabinoids also facilitate anything that is pleasurable. So anything good that's happening, it's going to amp up. And one of the things that it particularly seems to amp up is the pleasures of social connection. So when endocannabinoid levels are higher, everything that's pleasurable is more pleasurable, but like your story is more interesting. Your jokes are funnier. If you give me a high five, it's going to feel more satisfying. Or if you give me a hug, it's going to feel better. Or if I'm able to help you, I'm going to get more of that helper's high, that warm glow. And I think that's really interesting because, right, so endorphins make you feel really good. It's like a high. But the runner's high is more about sort of putting you into a brain state that allows you to be a good version of yourself in community. And there's a lot of like anthropological speculation about why that would be. But the idea is basically human beings, we are adapted to be physically active and cooperate in communities. And as soon as you are moving your body and getting your heart rate up, your brain is like, oh, right, we're hunting, we're foraging, we're gathering. And then we need to bring it back to our tribe, and we need to share with one another. And we need to feel good about the fact that I just, spent 2 hours out in the field gathering food, and now I'm giving it away to other people so that they can eat. And that's what the runner's high is. It's a brain state that allows you to sustain optimism and effort, and that makes you enjoy connecting with other people even more. And this is why exercise is like the best reset you can do for yourself. Because just imagine, like every time you exercise, you're becoming that version of yourself.
I mean, I'm blown away listening to this, Kelly. It's putting a lot of the pieces together that people kind of intuitively feel, but you're giving some of those mechanisms and some of the science behind why they feel the way that they feel. You know, I love looking at things through an evolutionary lens, and it makes sense when you look at it. Why would it cause these things in the body? Yeah, it would bring us together. It would help us with our tribe, with our community. In fact, one of my favorite bits in the book is when you talk about the Hadza tribe.
Yeah.
And what goes on in that, how much they move per day, and also how their elderly tend to move. They tend to move more as they get older, I think I read.
Yeah, you continue to be an active part of your community. So this is one of the last hunter-gatherer societies. And I think the research is that they are moderately to vigorously active for a couple hours a day. That's like that higher intensity activity. And then another couple of hours of sort of lighter to moderate activity, like walking around. And the evolutionary idea is that this is how humans survived. We were willing to exert ourselves because the climate changed and humans had to do that in order to feed themselves. And we were willing to cooperate and share. And, one of the themes of the research as I experienced it and in talking to people is that they are so connected. The rewards that we get from playing an active role in our lives, literally active, being engaged, exerting ourselves, pursuing meaningful goals, and the rewards that we get from connecting with other people and being part of a community, they are so connected that it's one of the reasons why people who are physically active are less lonely. They have better relationships with other people. There's something about being sedentary that makes it more difficult to be that version of ourselves that thrives in community. And I don't mean, I don't want to shame anyone who doesn't exercise or feels like they can't for physical or mental health reasons. And yet at the same time, I feel like it's really important to express this message that to whatever degree you can move your body, it makes you a different version of yourself that it's not even just better for other people. It allows you to experience that core human joy of interdependence.
Yeah. I mean, Kelly, we've both written books on stress, and we know very well that exercise helps make us more resilient to stress. And, one of the things I loved reading about in the book was how those areas of the brain that help us manage stress, the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, have got relatively high concentrations for endocannabinoids.
Yes, and oxytocin, which is something else that can get released from exercise. Yeah, so how exercise helps us with stress, it is both on that short term. So if you're feeling stressed out, you're feeling anxious or angry, it's going to change your brain chemistry in a way that gives you more hope and more energy. That's the common denominator. That's the feel better effect. But also we know that people who are regularly active, it actually changes the structure and the function of their brains in ways that basically teaches the brain how to be resilient to stress and also more sensitive to joy. So you're going to have an increased availability of dopamine and endocannabinoid and endorphin receptors. Your brain is basically going to say, oh, I guess we can experience joy and meaning in life and hope and optimism. So let's just be ready for it in a way that increases people's mood and joy in a much more generalized way. But the one thing I wanted to make sure we talk about, I mentioned it once, myokines, which I think is the most exciting area of research in terms of how exercise affects stress resilience and mental health, is this new observation. And forgive me, I don't know if you've talked about this on your podcast yet, have you?
No, I haven't.
Okay, great. Let me be the one who gives the good news. So just in the last decade or so, biologists have realized that our muscles are basically an endocrine organ. And just like your pituitary gland, your adrenal glands, they can synthesize and pump out proteins and peptides into your bloodstream that affect every system of your body. So your muscles will manufacture these proteins and peptides, and they basically release them into your bloodstream when you contract your muscles in a regular and continuous way. So any form of exercise, any form of movement. And some of these proteins and these chemicals, so they're called myokines, which just means set into motion by your muscles. Some of them kill cancer cells. Some of them reduce inflammation. Some of them are good for your immune function. They're good for your cardiovascular health. Some of them help you regulate blood sugar. So a lot of scientists now think myokines are the reason that exercise is good for your health and prevents every kind of disease. It reduces your risk. I mean, we're all going to get something, but reduces your risk. But what I'm so fascinated by as a psychologist is some of these myokines have their strongest effects on your brain. So let's say you go for a walk or you're lifting weights and your muscles are pumping these chemicals out into your bloodstream that can cross your blood-brain barrier. And in your brain, their primary effect is to act as an antidepressant and to change the structure of your brain in ways that make you more resilient to stress, whether that's changes to your hippocampus or your prefrontal cortex. And some of the first researchers who wrote about this called them hope molecules. Because they're like, but well, in part it's for these horrible studies that I don't particularly endorse where you traumatize rodents and then you either have them exercise or you literally inject them with some of these myokines. And what you find is they don't become traumatized and depressed psychologically in the way that they normally would if you traumatize them. And so they're like, it's like your muscles are manufacturing hope molecules when you exercise. And this to me is like the miracle of the human form. The idea that your muscles can manufacture antidepressants and they will deliver them to your brain when you exercise. And it's all of your muscles. So if you can't use your legs, you can use your arms. If you can't use your arms, maybe you can brace your core. If you can move any muscles, your muscles will release these chemicals that support your health and support your brain resilience. And it's something that you can choose, even if you don't have access to other forms of mental health care. Yeah. It's miraculous, and that your muscles know how to do it.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible. I tell you what popped into my head. I was thinking about elderly people who maybe are immobile and are sat down for a lot of the day and maybe have lost their balance. I'm thinking, well, maybe they can have a couple of light dumbbells next to their chair. And yeah, maybe their legs aren't working, but maybe if every day they at some point, for 5-10 minutes, just rock out a few bicep curls, you're going to be releasing those myokines. You're going to be getting those hope molecules. You're going to be having all these changes to your mood, your physiology, your inflammation.
And the literal structure of your brain. I mean, you literally are building a different brain.
Yeah, so to really try and think about making this accessible to everyone, even people who maybe are sedentary, might be able to do something like that to get some of these benefits. And I think that's incredibly empowering for people.
Yeah. And so I've been really curious about this because a lot of the early research was looking at higher intensity exercise and athletes. And there does seem to be a bit of a dose-response relationship where anything you do is going to release these positive myokines. Any form of movement. When you go from zero to anything, this is why I think we know that people who move for 10 minutes a day have reduced risk of mortality. It's everything counts. And also, the more you do, the longer you do it, and the harder it is, the more your muscles release myokines. And I think this explains why a lot of people who are recovering from addiction, recovering from depression, recovering from grief, recovering from stroke, because of how it enhances your brain's ability to recover, many people find that actually intensity is like upping your dose of a medicine that's really good for you. And I feel like it's important to point both of those out because I can't tell you how many people I spoke to who needed to find for themselves a certain level of intensity that was almost like a switch was flipped in their psychological well-being. And so this is that, in the great tradition of improv, it's yes and. Yes, do anything and it will help you. And also, to the degree that you are choosing to push to the level of intensity that challenges you, you can really have dramatic changes in your mental health and your brain health.
Yeah, incredible. Really, really incredible.
What I think is fascinating is that healthy dietary patterns and unhealthy dietary patterns are not related to each other. They're not just the opposite of each other. There'll be lots of people who have really, particularly like kids, have lots of healthy food at home, but then they have lots of junk and processed foods when they're out and about. That is still problematic for mental health. There's other groups.
That is so key. Say that again. That is really, really key, because I think people think I can eat what I want, but if I have a bit of broccoli now and again, I'm being healthy.
That's right. And the evidence does not support that. In all of the incredibly extensive studies that we've done now, we see that healthy diet and unhealthy diet, wherever you sit on that scale, they're both independently related to mental health outcomes. So if you are having lots of healthy food but also having lots of junk and processed foods, it's still going to be a problem. Similarly, lots of older people will not be going out and having Maccas and, lots of junk and processed foods, but they'll be having a very limited kind of a white diet, whether at home or in a nursing home or what have you. And that's also problematic. So they're not just the opposite of each other, and we have to tackle both.
Yeah, key points. In terms of the diet that your participants in the SMILES trial went on, you mentioned what those foods are, and you've also mentioned that we don't know what it was about it. In my last book, The Stress Solution, there's a chapter on fiber and how that can help, with the gut microbiome and therefore stress levels. I quote some of your research. I quote some of John Cryan's research in there. What's really interesting for me, if we think about that diet, and I think I wrote a paragraph on this. I said, for me, whilst we're waiting for more research, there are a couple of things there which really spring out to me as it could be making a difference. You had fatty fish in there, I believe. There's fatty fish in the diet, was there?
Fatty fish and lots of olive oil as well.
Yeah, so there was some omega-3s from the fatty fish. You've obviously got all the benefits of olive oil. So either of those independently, you could make a case for thinking, was it that did it?
Yeah.
But then the big one for me, as well as that, was this whole point that you were encouraging a very diverse range of foods. And so let's talk a little bit about diversity of foods, and let's talk a little bit about the gut microbiome and why that is so important.
It's so critically important, and it's so interesting. We can see that medical science is being transformed a little bit in like how physics was transformed when they discovered the ultra small particles. This knowledge that these bacteria that have co-evolved with us have such an important role in our health is really giving us some new insights that we can act on to, I think, improve a lot of health outcomes. The bacteria in your gut in particular, very, very simply speaking, they break down the fibrous foods that our human enzymes can't break down. So fiber is found in plant foods, things such as vegetables, fruits, whole grain cereals, legumes, your nuts, your beans and lentils, etc. So all sorts of different types of plant foods have dietary fiber. The gut microbes break that down by a process of fermentation. And in that process of fermentation, they produce many, many, many metabolites. And it's the production of these metabolites that seems to be so important. And we know that they, for example, interact with every cell in the body through these particular receptors. They influence gene activity. I mean, really importantly, most of what we know so far comes from animal studies. So we always have to be a little bit cautious, but there are more and more human studies, and we're doing many studies in our centre that is, looking at this.
That's the Food and Mood Centre.
The Food and Mood Centre, that's
name.
right.
Absolutely love that name. Who came up with that?
Well, it was a joint effort between myself and the comms department at Deakin.
But I think that's progress in itself. And in the 21st century, we actually have an institution called the Food and Mood Centre. I think that's progress.
Well, it's unique in the world in its focus on nutritional psychiatry research. And we've got more than 20 different projects underway at the moment, many more in the planning stages. Trying to get funding for research, of course, is incredibly difficult, but we've had some traction with philanthropic funding, which has been great. But most of the studies that we're doing are looking at this diet, gut microbiome, mental health triangle, because we know that the gut microbiome is so important for our immune system, for our metabolism and body weight, for our brain health, and right across the board. And we know this from a number of different sources of information. And there's a huge amount of research that's being done across the world now in this field, which is wonderful because it means that we're getting advances in our knowledge very quickly. But at this point, what we know is that diet is the most important thing that affects the gut microbiota, and that you can change your gut microbiota and your gut health within a very short space of time, like even within days by changing your diet. And that's such a powerful thing to understand.
So do you have a certain recommendation you make for people in terms of diversity?
Yeah, so what we know so far, and again, we need more studies in humans, but on the basis of some pretty good evidence in humans as well as many, many studies in animals, we know that obviously we need dietary fibre because the bugs can't do what they're supposed to do without the dietary fibre. And, none of us are getting enough dietary fibre, not even close. In Australia, less than 0.5% of children and adolescents get their recommended intake of vegetables and legumes. That's less than 0.5%. So this is not
less than 0.5%.
Yes,
wow.
This is not just an issue for those of lower education or income. This is something across the board. Less than 5% of adults in Australia. So we're not getting enough dietary fibre, so the bugs can't do what they're supposed to do. But polyphenols seem to be really important. These are the things that are in colourful fruits and vegetables and green tea and dark chocolate and things like that.
And coffee, for those coffee lovers out there, they contain polyphenols.
Right. Yeah. And really fascinating work, again in animals, but showing that if you put one bunch of rodents on a normal diet, they don't necessarily gain weight. But if you put another group on a high-fat diet, of course, they gain a lot of weight. But if you put a third group on a high-fat diet and then supplement it with polyphenols, they only put on about half as much weight.
Yeah, you mitigate it.
Yeah, so incredibly interesting research. But then your healthy fats, your mono and your polyunsaturated fats, in your quality proteins. But it might also be what you're not eating that's really important in your gut health.
Yeah.
Again, from animal studies, we see that emulsifiers, which are ubiquitous in processed foods, seem to strip the gut lining. We see that artificial sugars seem to have a negative impact on the gut. It's very complex. We're really only just scratching the surface. But I think the key understanding is we already know what sort of diet is consistently linked to longevity. And that's a diet that is high in plant foods and high in a diversity of plant foods, because the more diverse your diet, the more diverse your gut microbiome, and that seems to be a marker of gut health.
It's incredible. The Hadza tribe, this hunter-gatherer tribe in Tanzania, whose lives are relatively untouched by modernity, I read that they're exposed to 2,000 different plant foods in their lifetime. I think they eat about 800 of them. And you compare that to, I think about 60% of the world's food intake comes from 3 plants, which is it's just remarkable to see.
Yeah.
And I believe that they have between 100 and 150 grams of fibre per day.
Yeah.
Per day.
And we're lucky to get 20 in the West.
We're lucky to get 20.
And then your microbiome, it sort of goes down the toilet, so to speak, because it can't do what it's supposed to do, and then you're losing microbial diversity. And we also see that the large-scale industrial food system and the changes to our global diets, not only is that, of course, driving this massive increase in chronic disease, but also we see a lot of autoimmune conditions and allergic, illnesses. In Australia, where I am in Melbourne, it is the food allergy capital of the world, and it's certainly one of the asthma capitals as well. No one really understands why, but we think it's linked to the early life gut microbiome because based on what we know so far, the early life gut microbiota plays a really key role in the development of our immune system and also our brain development. Now, we've just finished a really important study in pregnant women at the Royal Children's Hospital looking at whether if you help women to change their diet during pregnancy, does it affect the infant microbiome? Because we need to make sure that the infant microbiome is optimised, we think, to ensure that that child has a strong immune system and optimal brain development.
Yeah, I mean, the implications of this are huge, really, because, we start talking about the SMILES trial. So somebody who has got depression may start to get some benefit from changing their diet. That's incredible in itself. But taking that research on and thinking about what you just said, if early life is so important and if the diet of a pregnant lady is so important, if we're trying to get to the root of a problem, yes, it's great to be able to treat people who've got a problem, but wouldn't it be great if the research builds up where we know, actually, you know what, when you're pregnant or maybe when even pre-conceiving, it's important then to focus on your health and your microbiome health. The implications in terms of the downstream effects could be profound.
That's right. And I talk about that a lot in the book.
You do. It's a really nice bit.
The metabolic state, so whether parents to be are overweight or obese, whether they've got high blood glucose, all of those things seem to be very clearly linked to both cognition and other developmental outcomes in children. We led the first study looking at the potential role of mothers' diets during pregnancy on children's emotional health. There's been many, many more studies since then showing that what mothers eat during pregnancy is linked to their children's emotional health, even when you take into account all sorts of other really important factors. And certainly if you look at the animal studies, you see that if you feed pregnant rats or mice or other non-human primates, those sorts of animals, a junk food, Western type diet during their pregnancy, you see all sorts of impacts on the offspring that are relevant to mental health in humans.
You see it in, we talk about diet. I wrote a chapter on touch when I was writing about stress. And I was looking at this research that shows that pups who lick their offspring a lot when they're young, you modify their response to stress for the rest of their life, because that sort of close contact with your parents at a young age almost in many ways sets your stress responsiveness for the rest of your life. It's really quite incredible. But one thing, Felice, I think you do beautifully well in the book is you write with real compassion. And when you talk about diet for pregnant women, you also talk about, wait a second, let's not feel bad about this. Let's not put blame on people. And I think it's really important when we're talking about what a pregnant mother is eating, because a lot of people will hear that and go, oh no, when I conceived, I was having McDonald's every day, and what impact has that had? And I think there's I'd love to explore what you think about that. It's not about making people feel bad about their choices, is it?
No, that's right. And my jumping off point is always around public health, and the fact that we need to make our environment supportive of healthful food choices. So in the West now, even if you go and fill up your car with petrol or anywhere you go, you are bombarded with opportunities and marketing to prompt you to consume these ultra-processed food products. Now in the US, nearly 60% of energy intake is coming from ultra-processed food products. 60% of children alive today in the US will be obese, not just overweight, obese by the time they're 35, which is their prime child-rearing years. It's not quite as bad in the UK and Australia, but we're certainly getting there. And that's because the food environment supports really poor choices. We have very few limits on marketing. So big food can market, really with impunity. These foods are very, very cheap. They're very easy to produce. They've got a very long shelf life. They're highly palatable. I mean, we are designed to want those sorts of high-fat, high-sugar foods, and they're ubiquitous. They're just everywhere. We can't escape them. So the food environment makes it very difficult to make healthful food choices. And I talk about this a lot in the book, is that it's not about individuals. Yes, we want to empower people to make healthful choices in their life, but it shouldn't be that hard, because the environment needs to support those healthful choices.
I think you start off in the book talking about the Victorian times, don't you? And that's a nice example of this.
Well, it was such an interesting
I never heard of this before.
No, it was a paper that I just came across, and it was written by anthropologists and historians. And they talked about this incredibly brief period in the mid-1800s in Britain when the health of the population was exceptionally good. So if people survived their first 5 years of life, then they had a lifespan that's similar to what we have now, but their rates of degenerative disease were about 10% of what we have now. Now, the reasons for that were very clearly the environment. There were various political imperatives at the time that meant that governments were making sure that the population was getting access to the fresh food that was being grown in farms outside of the cities and brought in on trains. People were growing a lot of food themselves, so that they were having fruit trees or growing vegetables in their backyard. They had chickens. People had a lot of access to seafood. There was a lot of for a whole number of reasons, people had access to lots of fruits and vegetables, nuts. When people did eat meat, they ate all of the meat, all the organs and everything, but they didn't have that much meat. They, of course, had really unprocessed, unmilled bread. And people were doing a lot of physical activity as part of their working life. And at the time, people were exceptionally healthy and very, very strong on average. And then in about 1870, you started to see importation of canned meat, with very high in salt and fat, canned fruit, very high in sugar, condensed milk, white bread and white flour, these sorts of things. And by the end of the century, the army had to to lower its average height intake because people were actually stunted in growth. People couldn't eat meat and vegetables and nuts and things like that because their teeth were so bad because of all the sugar they were eating. And it just had such a remarkable impact on the health of the population on average in such a short time span in one generation. So it just says this is the food environment drives health. Yeah, or otherwise.
It really does. It reminds me of a conversation I had with Dan Buettner on the podcast recently, who studied all the blue zones around the world, these little pockets of populations where they seem to live to a ripe old age in really good health. And what he says is something that's been clear for a long time, which is that people in those areas, they're not trying to be healthy. They're just getting on with their lives. The environment just means that the easy choice, and then the only choice often is the healthy choice. Whereas we're living in an environment now where the easy choice is often the most the most unhelpful choice. And I give you an example. Literally last night, you met my cousin when you came in here today, who's staying with me for a couple of days. And we were driving back from a concert last night, and I was chatting to him about food. And he's in his late 20s, working hard. He says he commutes. It's about a 10-minute drive from his office back to his apartment. And as he's driving back, if he finishes work at 7:30, he's obviously tired, probably stressed out from the day. And he says on the way home, he passes so many junk food shops. He says one roundabout in particular, there's a strong smell of, I won't say what brand it is, but a very popular fast food chain from around the world. You can actually smell the food as you're driving through it. And it's almost as if he will have to fight temptation every single day. And you ain't going to fight temptation every single day. No. You are going to crack at some point.
Absolutely.
And then he also reports to me, this is just, we were chatting about it simply because I said, I told him I'm interviewing you tomorrow, and he was interested. And he said, it's really interesting. Well, I haven't had junk food for a while. I don't really crave it. But once I have it once, I kind of want it again later that week. Yeah. Have you studied this at all?
No, but it makes sense because we know that the high fat and high sugar foods interact with the reward systems in the brain, like any of the pleasurable activities, whether smoking, drinking, gambling, drugs, all these sorts of things interact with that reward system in the brain and basically train the brain to perform actions that give that dopamine hit. And food is just another one of those sorts of drivers of the dopaminergic or the reward system in the brain. So having that sort of food everywhere and the smells and the cues to consume it, it's almost impossible to not consume it. So we have to change the environment.
Do you get tempted? You obviously, this is your field. I'm sure you practice what you preach as far as possible. You're human like the rest of us. Do you, you're traveling, you've got jet lagged, you're sleep deprived, you're at train stations today, you're at airports. Do you find that when your defenses are down and you're traveling that you get tempted to go down an unhelpful route?
Look, I'm by no means a purist, and I think it's actually really bad for your mental health to be really hung up on the details and being perfect with all your food choices. I go by the 80-20 rule. Yeah. And certainly if 80% of my food choices are good, that's going to put me way above the rest of the population based on what we know about how poorly people are eating. I had popcorn on the way up today because I'm really, really jet lagged, but I also had a big vegetable soup that I got at the station. And, I find that you can make healthy choices nowadays, which is great because even 10 years ago, there were no healthy choices from takeaway. But now you've got Mexican, you've got Japanese, you often can buy really nice soups. You can get kombucha to drink in the takeaway. So things are certainly improving. Basically, my recommendation is just try and avoid the ultra-processed foods and have as much diversity of whole foods as you can. And so what we call a plant-predominant diet. Yeah. I do really worry about the low-carb and the high-fat diets. As I said, we're about to start.
For longevity or because in the short term, people are getting good results on them with things like their blood sugar and certainly weight loss for sure. Yeah. And some are reporting improved cognition in the short term. So is your worry long-term or, expand on that?
It's long-term. So what we see from all of the evidence is that long-term diets that are higher in complex carbohydrates and lower in animal protein and fat are linked to longevity. But in the short term, diets that are lower in carbohydrates and higher in animal protein and fat are linked to leaner body weight and more reproductive success.
I do want to touch on whole grains because whole grains have become quite a controversial area in the diet wars. And I think that's because often what we consider to be whole grains are not whole grains. So I think it's quite clear that there's pretty good research suggesting that real whole grains can have beneficial impacts on your gut microbiome and consequently on your overall health, including your moods. What do you see the problem with whole grains? Is it that interpretation? Is it that the food industry are marketing refined grains as whole grains?
Yes, basically, yes. And I think, people in the US where their food system is just so broken and has been for decades, to the point where nobody alive today in the US remembers what normal food looks like. I mean, it really is, it's a rarity. And for them, whole grain might be a brown bread that's still highly refined and full of all sorts of things. But if you look at certainly the epidemiological data, whole grain intake is, out of all of the food groups, the most strongly associated with improved health outcomes. If you look at the gut and what we know so far, whole grains, and here we're talking about things like oats and barley and freekeh and spelt and buckwheat and brown rice. So things that are true whole grains are just a really valuable source of fibre for that fermentation process of the gut. But they're also anti-inflammatory. And they also help with satiety. They help you to feel full. Now, in Korea, they have these multi-stage meals, and you start off with, and you have about 10 dishes or, however many depending on the meal. But you start off with salads and then you move on to seafood and then maybe a little bit of meat. And then right at the end, you'll have a small pot of mixed rice, that wild rice and black rice and that sort of thing, right at the end, just to aid with satiety. And that's probably how we should be eating, with small amounts but lots of diversity of grains. And for me, what I would just say is that people, half of their plate should be vegetables and salads. A quarter should be a form of a whole grain. A quarter should be a form of good quality protein, and then topped off with some healthy oil in the form of olive oil. So it can be really simple like that.
That's really good, simple advice. I mean, one thing I've seen clinically, and you see a lot of these case reports online, but I have seen it people who've read them and have cut out all grains, and they actually do feel better in the short term sometimes. And I often wonder why that is. Is it because then I also look at the data showing that whole grains are really great for longevity and the health of the gut microbiome. And sort of my hypothesis at the moment is that many of us have got disrupted gut microbiomes, because of the way we're living our lives, because of our diets, because of our stress levels, the fact that we're sleep deprived, all these things that influence the gut microbiome. And I think many of the patients who come in to see me who are not feeling well have already got a disrupted gut microbiome. So sometimes when they eliminate certain foods in the short term, actually, because you could eliminate grains and eliminate a lot of the processed stuff as well. And then so you start to feel great. And it doesn't necessarily mean that needs to be the long-term approach. And I think this is a key thing that I'm going to explore more in the future, is the difference between a short-term approach versus what is an optimal long-term approach. And I guess FODMAPs might play part of the, might be part of the story there.
That's right. One of my postdocs is one of the world experts on FODMAP. FODMAPs and low FODMAP diets and the impact on the microbiome. And what we know about FODMAPs is that they are a primary source of fermentation for the gut microbiota. In other words, they're probably the best gut bug food that you can feed it. But as you say, if you've got a gut that is not a healthy gut because of a long-term Western diet and stress and all of those other things, then you're going to have problems digesting those sorts of foods because your gut bugs aren't optimized to actually deal with them. And then a short-term solution is the low FODMAP diet, but it's never intended to be a long-term thing. It should only ever be a short-term, and then people can gradually reintroduce the FODMAP foods, but preferably do it, I would say, with fermented foods and maybe some probiotics. I know that there's a lot of work going into looking at whether supplementing with probiotics and or fermented foods on reintroduction helps the bacteria to adapt so that people can tolerate those foods more. But I do agree that a lot of people in the West, because our diets are so low in fibre and so low in diversity, they react poorly to whole grains, often to legumes and the foods that provide the substrate for the gut bacteria, because their guts are just not able to deal with them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it goes back to this whole lack of training in healthcare professionals on nutrition means that a lot of people go to their doctors, they feel very frustrated that they're not being offered decent solutions that make sense to them. So they're reading things online, they're trying them, feeling good in the short term, but then continuing that long term without any support. And
Yes.
again, I'm not criticizing. I totally get it. That's one of the reasons why I like to do these podcasts every week, is to talk to world leading experts like yourself and really just tease out, practical experience, research evidence, where we're at, just so people can start thinking. Because I think the more we can empower people, I think the better able they are to make healthy choices. But I also recognize that ultimately it's the food environment that will make the biggest change. Felice, look, I could talk to you about for hours on this topic, but I think we should start wrapping it up, bringing it to a close. First of all, I want to say thank you, because the SMILES trial that you did, literally, I think will go down as being one of the most game-changing trials in terms of research on diet and mental health, because it was a randomized controlled trial and the results were so stark. So thank you for persevering and going through all the hard work and potential risk of actually falling flat on your face to go through it. No, so genuinely, I think it's incredible, and it's helping to give real weight globally to the notion that our diet can improve our mood and our mental health. Where do you see this field developing over the next few years? What's next, do you think?
At the Food and Mood Centre, as I mentioned, we're doing a lot of research to try and plug some of the gaps. We want to see whether what we know about the link between nutrition and mental health is true in other disorders outside of depression, and come up with more prevention and treatment strategies. Getting to this point where we can understand what works for whom under what circumstances, I think, is really important. And the gut microbiota is the roadmap by which we'll get there, I think. These personalised recommendations for diet, but also medication use. But really, my focus now is on getting clinical practice changed. And so I've joined with a number of the strongest researchers in the world doing exercise, mental health research, and us doing the nutrition, mental health research, to push for this lifestyle psychiatry, this idea of lifestyle medicine as a fundamental principle and jumping off point in psychiatry, not instead of other treatments, but as the basis to support those treatments.
The bedrock upon which everything else goes. Yeah.
And we think that not only will it have enormous benefits for individuals, but it will have enormous benefits for the public purse because of the costs associated with mental disorders, particularly depression.
And there's please do tell the listeners about this conference that you're sort of hosting in London later this year.
So in 2013, I set up the International Society for Nutritional Psychiatry Research, and that was done to try and get more people researching in this area. And that now has more than 400 members from across the world. And we're having our second major international conference in October between the 20th and the 22nd in London. And it's got some amazing speakers. It's going to be a really great conference.
Healthcare professionals, this is for?
Yeah, healthcare professionals, scientists,
is there an event
policymakers.
Is there an event for the public as well?
On the Sunday, the opening day, myself and Kimberly Wilson, who does the Food and Psych podcast. She's a previous winner of the Great British Bake Off. She's a psychologist. She and I will open the conference with a session that is open to the public. So, I think that's going to be really exciting.
And for those of you listening, guys, everything that Felice and I have spoken about today are going to be on the show notes page to this episode of the podcast, which is going to be drchatterjee.com/Brain Changer. Brain Changer is the name of your fabulous new book. So I would definitely encourage everyone who's interested to get it. It's so full of actionable information. It's a really good read as well. I think it's very fun reads. So I think people should get that. But I'm also going to link to that conference. So if you are interested, you can go on to drchatterjee.com/Brain Changer and actually see some of the studies we talked about. I'm going to link to all of those. I'm also going to link to that conference so you can buy some tickets if you want to attend for sure. Final question. This podcast is called Feel Better, Live More. And the reason is it's pretty straightforward. I genuinely believe, whether we're talking about mental health, whether we're talking about anything, when we feel better in ourselves, we get more out of our lives. Mm-hmm. And so I always love to leave the listener with some top tips that they can think about straight away and think, oh God, I think I could apply that into my own life immediately to change the way that I feel. So I wonder if you could share, you probably covered a lot of them already, but just at the end here, just to inspire the listeners, what are Professor Felice Jacka's top tips?
What you eat really does matter to your mental and brain health in the short term as well as the long term. So pay attention to it, and it doesn't need to be expensive or fussy or difficult. It can just be really basic peasant food. cooked up without much in the way of complex recipes. It really does help. And getting regular exercise. If I don't exercise, I don't sleep properly and everything falls apart. So finding something that you really like doing, whether it's just big walks in the park or resistance training or whatever it is, just try and move, because that has such a flow-on benefit to everything else.
Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying this conversation, there's loads more like it on my channel. Please do press subscribe and hit that bell. Now, back to the conversation. If someone was to ask me what I think the number one problem in society is, and again, I'm not very good at choosing just one thing when I'm asked that question, but I think it's solitude. I think it's the fact that we have no downtime, we have no space. I think one of the negatives that technology has done, for all its positives, one of the negatives is, I don't think the negative that's been spoken about enough, which is the fact that any bit of downtime we previously had has been stolen from us. It's been eroded out of modern society, because we have something that is going to distract us and it is going to get our attention. These things are wired. Our own feeds with the algorithms, your own Netflix accounts, these things are programmed to feed you what is going to give you that dopamine hit, right? You can't compete with that. So if you are chronically looking at this stuff, I think for many of us, it is a distraction. For many of us, it means that we don't have to sit there in stillness and think about our lives.
I want you to think about this for a moment. I'm older than you, but I think one thing that we share in our general age bracket is that, to the extent that we are the same general generation, we are the last crop of people who know what it's like to live in a pre-internet world and now live in a fully connected world. Our childhood was marked by periods of boredom where we had to go out of our way to figure out creative ways to entertain ourselves. Like, the amount of energy that you would have to exude with your imagination to figure out how to spend time was, extraordinary. Fast forward to, the 12-year-old now, or the 10-year-old or the 8-year-old. They have to exert even more energy to not be distracted, to find boredom, to find stillness. And I think it cannot be overstated how profound a change that is. And I'm not sure that we really appreciate the extent to which that's going to change the course of humanity, because what is that person going to look like in 20 or 30 years when they're an adult? It's going to be a very different type of being. And I think now, more than ever, we're in a crisis of presence, in that we never have to be by ourselves ever again, ever. You have to go out of your way to find a moment of stillness. And who was it who said, all of man's suffering can be boiled down to his inability to spend, time alone with himself? I mean, we don't ever have to be alone with ourselves. And I know that I've found myself struggling with this because of how different my life is now from when I wrote my first book. Now there's so many more things vying for my attention, and a lot of those are driven by technology, that you have to move heaven and earth to create boundaries around that, to carve out a few moments of quiet, because you're expected to be accountable and in communication at every given moment of your waking day.
I agree that I don't think we recognize the gravity of this. I think when we're missing a lot of the big picture when we talk about even things like food and sugar, for example, as important as they are. When you understand where a lot of our behaviors come from, we unpacked a bit of this when I came on your show, but this whole idea of these underlying stressors in our life and how we then use our certain behaviors to compensate for them. I think a lack of downtime is one of the biggest stressors, because if you can't sit alone with your thoughts and you always need distraction, well, you're going to use distraction, whether it's social media, whether it's Netflix, whether it's food, right? So how much of unhealthy food intake is driven by an inability to sit and be alone? I think a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I think emotional eating is a condition that's underappreciated. It's easy to dismiss that, like, oh, I'm addicted to whatever kind of food. But, I think most people's compulsive eating behaviors and patterns are a function of this unconscious drive to change their emotional state, like this reflexive need to not feel whatever they're feeling, And I think if somebody was to do a food journal or to posit the question, like, how come I always end up face planting in the Haagen-Dazs, 3 times a week at midnight or whatever. Like, if you were to journal, like, what happened to you emotionally that day, like, there's triggers for these things, like something emotional. You're experiencing some kind of emotion that maybe you're not even consciously aware of or completely in touch with, that is compelling you in an unconscious way to behave in a certain way to change that emotional state so that you can feel different. So whether it's drugs and alcohol or food or the phone or whatever else is, it's all the same thing. It's all the same thing. Yeah. It is a, addictive predisposition to alter your emotional state and avoid having to confront, a feeling or an emotion, and an inability, because of the way we're hardwired, to understand that feelings are just that. They're feelings. Like when we have an uncomfortable feeling or a fear impulse or something like that, we're hardwired through our amygdala, which we talked about earlier, to think that we're in peril, we're going to die, right? And we're going to act accordingly to redress that. But the truth is, it's just an emotion. You're not going to die. And if you can develop the wherewithal to sit with it, to be in that discomfort, you will come to understand one fundamental aspect of emotions, which is that they are constantly in flux and they are not static, and it will change and it will pass. But it is only through the willingness to weather through that discomfort that you can become connected to that. And I think we're in a culture right now where nobody wants to be uncomfortable for a minute. And everything about society is oriented around luxury and comfort and convenience, and the idea of having to tolerate even a moment of discomfort is considered, something that we're trying to transcend. And yet, deep within us, we have a deep need to be in discomfort in order to grow. And I think that's why you're seeing like Spartan races and ultra endurance. Like if it's all about luxury and comfort and, a padded bank account, then why are all these people showing up to climb in the mud, on a cold Sunday morning? It's because as human beings, we're disconnected from that natural state. And I think the more that we're willing to be in discomfort, the more resilient we become, the more alive we feel, and the more connected to the planet, to ourselves, and to each other we learn to be.
So what's the take home for someone who's listening to this and who says, okay, I get it, Rich, I get what you're saying. I recognize your journey. I understand it. I don't think I'm in quite as much pain as you were. So maybe I don't have that motivator to go and make the changes that you have made and make the transformations. What would you say to that person who maybe doesn't see themselves as far gone as, let's say, you were, but still wants to make an improvement? How can they use what you just said about discomfort, about being alone with your thoughts? Is there a practical take-home you would give to them?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I would say is I'm sympathetic to that situation. In some ways, I think being like a super hardcore drug addict or alcoholic is like a blessing, because the problem is so obvious. It's like, oh, what's wrong with me? Well, it couldn't be, like Russell Brand always has this joke. He's like, it couldn't be the crack, could it? It's like, no, it's not the crack. It's this other thing. It's so glaring that that's your issue. And once you address that, you can course correct. But if what ails you isn't as acute as that, then it becomes more difficult to diagnose, and you can develop a tolerance to just live with it. You know what I mean? And I think that's the saddest place to be, because, you know, the alcoholic or the addict is going to flame out, and they're going to have to, you know, grapple with their problem and hopefully get beyond it. But you can go all the way to your grave if you have a much lower grade malaise and never really be compelled to confront it. So that's why I say I'm sympathetic to that person, because that becomes harder. The pain isn't great enough for them to really do anything about it, and they just persist. So my takeaway or suggestion to those people, and look, you know, first of all, I want to say, like, I'm not here to give advice to anybody. You know, I really go out of my way to try to avoid giving anybody advice. It is not for me to judge anybody's path or the choices they make about their life. All I can do is share my experience. And if that connects with people, that's great. So please, you know, take this with a grain of salt. But I just know from my own experience that the way that I can get myself to feel more alive is to carve out time and protect time to do things that I enjoy, first of all. You know, in my case, it happened to be fitness oriented, and that turned into ultra endurance. In you know, the listener's case, it could be anything. It could be painting, it could be stand-up comedy, it could be model trains, it could be anything. But I think it's really important, no matter how busy your life is, to exercise self-care by making sure that you do something that you love. And if you don't know what you love, try to remember the things that you enjoyed doing as a kid. What were you naturally drawn to? I mean, that's what brought me back into swimming and running. I think that's really important. And I think it's really important to step outside your comfort zone and challenge yourself to do something that scares you. And it doesn't have to be some big deal. It can be like you told the story earlier about putting on a wetsuit for the first time and getting in the water. Like, that's a scary thing if you've never done that. To me, it's nothing, because I've been doing that my whole life. But the point being, like, just even if you're extending yourself outside your comfort zone a little bit, I think it's important. And I think you'll find it to be incredibly gratifying. And I think it also fuels resilience and an openness to more change. And if you can kind of walk that path a little bit, I think the universe expands. It opens up for you in terms of other opportunities for yourself.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that's some great
advice. I don't know if that was pretty vague, but
yeah. I mean, I think it's helpful. I think it's super helpful. I think, of course, like all messages, it'll connect with some people, won't connect with others, but that's okay. That's the nature of change, right? Change happens when you're ready for that change. We can't make someone around us change. I don't know, since your journey, have you tried to, in inverted commas, make or help people around you change? And have you found that to be futile?
Yeah, it's completely codependent. You can't compel another human being to change. You have responsibility for yourself. Focus that energy inward and try to be the best version of you, of who you can be, and stay out of the crosshairs of somebody else's trauma or problem. You can make yourself available in a loving way, but I think, and I know this as somebody who's, I've been in the recovery community for a long time. I've gone to a lot of funerals. I've seen people die. I've seen people get sober. I've seen lives transformed, and I've seen other people really struggle. And I've been in that position of wanting to help them or extending myself to help somebody. And I can tell you for a fact that if somebody doesn't want to change, they're not going to change. They have to want it for themselves. Willingness is like the entire ball game when it comes to change.
Yeah, for sure. I think many of us know when we've found something, we found some insight in our life, we want to share it with those people around us. We want them to get on board with it. But, I just stick to my own business these days. I try my best just to work on myself, be the example for those people around you. Hopefully you can maybe provide a bit of inspiration for them.
There's an arrogance to that, though, as well, right? Like, oh, I've discovered this truth and now I want to help you discover it as well. And the way I look at it, the analogy that I use is, you can run around chasing people, trying to get them to change or see your truth. I think it's much more impactful and powerful to be the lighthouse, to like stand in your strength and, emit a certain frequency that is your truth. And the people that need to hear that will see that beam of light coming from your lighthouse, and they will come to you.
Yeah. And I think that's what you do with your podcast. I think that's genuinely what comes through the airwaves is you are, to me, living an authentic life. You have figured out, you have been through your trials and tribulations, and now you have, over a number of years, you're now starting to live a life that is aligned, what you really want out of life, what your heart wants out of life. Everything seems, to me at least, seems to be a lot more aligned than it probably was. Maybe there's still growth to go. Maybe there's still more alignment to come in.
The key word is more. Like I have plenty of work to do on myself. And that will continue for the rest of my life.
But you're doing the work. But that's the key, right?
You're certainly haven't. I don't have everything. I don't want to hold myself out as having like answers or as if I've figured everything out. My path is to try to narrow the dissonance between my behavior and my value system, right? So that I can walk the talk in as close to an aligned state as possible. Like that's the aspiration, right? How can the aspirational self merge with the actual self?
That's the biggest game of all, right?
Right. Yeah, that's what we're here to do. I believe we're all here to grow and to evolve. And, we work out our shit and our trauma with each other, and we do the best that we can, and we do it, mistakenly and imperfectly. And I just try to be gentle on myself and gentle with others and a support system to as many people as I can.
Rich, you mentioned that all of us to some degree have addiction. And I find that incredibly fascinating. I think long and hard about what Gabor Mate talks about. I think I very much agree with the majority of his viewpoint, if not all of it, actually. This idea that all addiction at its core is the same and comes from, I'm very careful not to sort of misquote him out of context. But my perception of what he is saying is that all addiction comes from some form of childhood trauma. And he defines trauma as, sure, bad things that happen to you, but also when not enough good things happen to you as well. I think that's a very important distinction that he makes. So with your own experience of addiction, do you subscribe to Gabor Mate's view? Do you think that's accurate? Do you think that holds true? I guess, as you reflect on your own life, do you think there's a modicum of truth within that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of truth to that. I had Gabor on my podcast as well, and he did what he's fond of doing. I haven't listened to your conversation with him, but I would imagine he might have done the same thing to you, which is turn the table and then he interviews you, right? I had a sense that he was going to do that, and I wanted him to do that. Like
I know the feeling. I was seeing before that as well. What is he going to?
Yeah, like I'm going to take advantage of this incredible
therapy
opportunity
session
I have for him to give me therapy. Yeah, and I went into that resistant to that thesis because, as I described earlier, I reflect back on my childhood as relatively charmed. Now I was, I was bullied, and I had, I was a loner, and I have these other indicia that contribute to, the alcoholic state. But my parents are happily married. My needs were met. We always had a roof over our head and all of that kind of stuff. So when I hear childhood trauma, I don't identify with that. Yeah. And what I needed to learn was the broad definition that he has when he says trauma. And that important caveat that you pointed out, which is that trauma isn't necessarily something that happened to you. It's something that, was withheld from you or something that you did not get. And through the process of that conversation, he helped me understand that certain emotional needs that I had weren't sufficiently met. And that doesn't mean that my parents, who I love very much, did a bad job. because what I cannot accept is this idea of vilification of my parents, who are very good people and did the very best that they could. What I can accept is this idea that perhaps within the context of them doing their very, very best, there was some emotional need that was not fulfilled that contributed to this later, state, this later condition that I had called alcoholism. I would, however, also add that I'm not convinced that that's the entire picture. I do think that there is a genetic component to alcoholism, that certain people have a disposition. And, Gabor might say, well, that's a function of epigenetics that goes back, that relates to childhood trauma that you could trace back generations and generations and generations. And I think that's a very appealing concept, and perhaps it's true. Maybe we need to, understand epigenetics a little bit better to really get behind that. And like I said earlier, I think there's certain people that are more sensitive than others. And as somebody who's been in the recovery community for a long time, like I've learned to identify a certain strain of human. Like I can spot somebody a mile away walking down the street, and I go, oh, that person's in recovery, or that person like I can see it. Like I can, and maybe that's a function of their childhood trauma as Gabor Mate sees it, but I think maybe the full picture is a little bit more complicated. But I think that model is really important that he's pointed out, and I find a lot of truth in that. And I think he is incredible, and his book, In the Realm of the Hungry Ghost, is just an extraordinary book that everybody should read.
Did you challenge him at all? Or did you... I've actually not heard your conversation with him, which is rare for me.
Yeah, it was a long time ago. It was early on in the show. It was many years ago.
Were you able to challenge him on that, in the sense that this genetic component, or were you too much in it?
I was super in it, and I was emotional. I'm pretty sure I cried. Like it was heavy. You know what I mean? It was meaningful for me. So no, I mean, look, I can't even remember, but I seriously doubt that I challenged him on that. He did say one thing to me afterwards when we were done, and he's like, I think you could benefit from ayahuasca, and if you're interested in that, I would really like to help you, and I can, you can come with me on one of these things. And that's something that I found coming up with increasing regularity. I mean, maybe it's particular to Los Angeles, and I'd be interested in your experience with the quote unquote plant medicine. I've had lots of friends who have done this, and I can't dismiss that I think it's had beneficial impacts on people. But I don't think that's anything that I'll ever pursue for myself, for a couple of reasons. I mean, first of all, I think it's dangerous to tell an alcoholic or an addict in recovery that the answers they seek can be found in a mind-altering substance. That really frightens me, to be honest with you. And if I was to go into it frightened, then maybe that wouldn't be such a good trip. And I think, secondly, that experience can provide you with a glimpse of what it's like to have a broader spiritual perspective. But I think it's just a glimpse, and it's not earned, and I think there are ways to earn that through meditation and mindfulness and these other practices related to spiritual growth that I think would have a more permanent and profound impact in the long term.
Yeah, I spoke to Michael Pollan recently when he was in the UK about his latest book, and about the science about what psychedelics can do for our mental health and from altering our perspective, and his own experience through it, coming from the standpoint of someone highly, highly skeptical. And towards the end, I asked him, are there other ways to access that state? He was like, absolutely. There are other ways to get there. Deep breathing, meditation, all kinds of things, when practiced regularly, consistently, can also get you to that point. I guess we've all got these emotional layers, right? And trying to figure out who we are. Now, you had that instant where those two incidents which forced you, well,
which motivated you perhaps to change. And I guess one thing I heard you say, Rich, which pinged in my ear, because I don't think I've heard you say it before. You said something about alcoholism, and you said, I can't remember verbatim, but I think you said something like alcohol was something I used to suffer from, or you said something in the past tense. And why that struck me is that, certainly until recently, I guess I've not heard you talk about this for a while, but would you identify now as an alcoholic?
Yes. Yeah.
That's why it struck me.
Yeah.
Because you said was.
It's interesting.
I think.
I can't remember what I said, but it would be strange if I used alcoholism in the past tense, because I don't think of it in that term, in those terms. Like I am an alcoholic in recovery. I'm still, sobriety is my number one priority. My relationship with my recovery and my recovery community is, is the most important thing in my life. It has to come before everything else, because if I'm not sober and can't maintain my sobriety, everything else in my life goes away. So I don't think that, at least in my own, like, again, it goes back to, like, I'm not speaking for anybody but myself, but I have not, and don't believe that I ever will, graduate from alcoholism. I am an alcoholic in recovery, and that recovery process is a daily reprieve. That being said, I don't walk around craving alcohol. Like, it's not like, oh man, like I think I might drink tonight. Like, it's not like that. That could happen. I do have a daily reprieve from drinking, but it's really about treating how my alcoholism shows up in my life on a daily basis through my behavior, and inventorying that behavior and constantly trying to better myself and overcome my character defects that emanate from and are a result of this alcoholic disposition that I have.
Do you think it's possible to leave something like alcoholism behind?
I don't know. I mean, I think this is, it goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning about identity and the stories we tell about who we are. And we think of ourselves in a certain way, in a strict way, like, I am an alcoholic. This is my identity. I'm an alcoholic in recovery. Can you transcend that? I mean, I think I'm a spiritual being having a human experience. Alcoholism is something that I suffer from. For me, I think it's dangerous to step into a place of thinking that I've transcended this thing. And I say that as somebody who, I went to rehab in 1998. So it's 21 years.
Since you last had a drink.
But at 13 years of sobriety, I had a 4-hour relapse and had to reset the clock. I've spoken about this publicly on the podcast before. Yeah. And at that moment, after having been sober for 13 years, to pick up a drink was an extremely disorienting and baffling thing that I thought would never, ever happen in my life. And now I can do a forensic analysis on everything that occurred that led me to making that choice. And it involves decisions that I made many, many, many months in advance of that actually happening. And it all has to do with my relationship to my alcoholism. But I never questioned whether I was an alcoholic, but I think I had taken my foot off the gas in terms of the actual work required in recovery to maintain sobriety, that I became vulnerable. And I will tell you this, I took that drink. I couldn't tell you why I did it. And it happened so quick. And before you know it, I had like 5 or 6 drinks in me. It was like not a day had gone by since I had stopped drinking. And my alcoholism had been doing push-ups in the dark, just waiting for that moment, that vulnerable moment to pounce on me. And it was a very powerful reminder that I very much had not transcended this disease and perhaps may never transcend it. And it gave me, ultimately it was a gift, because it reminded me of just how powerful this thing is. And the minute I start to think that I've overcome it, I once again become vulnerable. And I think what happens when you have a number of years of sobriety is that you start to relax a little bit and you start to think you have it all figured out. And you kind of saunter in and out of the rooms like the guy who's got all the answers and the person who gets the phone calls when somebody relapsed and you're going to drop the pearls of wisdom on them. And what was so great, what was so awesome about this relapse, as demoralizing and humiliating as it was that it reframed the whole thing for me and made me realize that how important humility is and how important it is that I make sobriety my number one priority, and that I don't have it all figured out, and that I'm constantly learning, and that I really only have like one day at a time.
Yeah, I mean, that is super powerful. You're right. After 13 years, I guess many people around you would have thought, hey, he's cracked this thing. He's done. He's out.
No.
So I guess I would imagine there's a certain fear associated with that. When you've seen what can happen, it's like, I don't know, I'm sort of, I guess, we talk about the stories that we tell ourselves, and I guess that is not a criticism of anyone, because I tell myself stories as well. I think we have to tell ourselves a story. Coming back to plant medicine, I've spoken to a lot of people who've done it, and one of the things they will tell you consistently is that you see the world in a different way. You realize that everything we do is just a story. We've just created a narrative, and we can just as easily, maybe not just as easy, but if we want to, we can create a different narrative. So I guess if the story you tell yourself about this is that you are a recovering alcoholic and you're not going to transcend this, I guess in many ways it doesn't really matter, does it? Because you're telling yourself a story that allows you to engage in your life and be productive and do the things you want to do, right?
I get totally where you're going with this. But I think you also nailed my response, which is it doesn't matter because it's not going to change my behavior.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, I'm still going to do the things that I need to do to stay sober and that have allowed me to continue to grow. I think what you're getting at is like, to label yourself as this, aren't you restricting, ultimately the growth that you could, avail yourself of if you kind of let go of that label? I'm not trying to put pressure on you. I'm trying to explore this. I find it fascinating. I do not know what it feels like to be on the journey you have been on. I don't know that feeling. This area fascinates me. Your story fascinates me, and I'm not trying to probe something where you don't want to go. I'll go anywhere. Like, I think I think what you're dancing around the edges of is a really profound question, which is, is it possible to transcend these things? And I think as, infinite light beings, yes, I think it is possible. You can become enlightened and no longer be shackled by this, this thing we call addiction or alcoholism. I would say that I'm not there yet, and most likely will never be there. And I'm just trying to get better every single day. But I think, I have to be respectful and mindful of, the power, the beastliness of this demon that, if not kept in check, could take me down, So, and in order to keep it at bay, there's certain things that I have to do every single day, and they're not that hard and they're not that complicated, but they're super important.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Thanks for going there. I think there's a lot we can all learn from that. No matter what challenges we've got in our life, they may seem very distant. They may feel not even on the same page, not even the same book as what you've gone through. But I think, even this idea that a daily practice of something towards something, to whatever that focus is, I think that's an inspiring story. A lot of people these days are suffering with the effects of stress, the consequences of being chronically stressed and not actually adequately recuperating from that. And everyone's looking for the hack. What can I do to keep my life super, super busy, but what can I do that's going to somehow magically de-stress me? And it's fascinating for me that breathing could well be
one of the simplest and one of the most accessible things to all of us, yet it's something that very few of us are actively looking at and actively practicing. Why do you think that is?
I think we've moved ourselves far enough away from inside out understanding that outside in has become our go-to default. I look at my phone for an answer to something, right? I'm on social media for things, for answers to things. I look at heart rate monitors for things. I look, it continues to add up on the outside in so we're missing there's a big variant in that. Like there's a big variation in that, because to understand how you feel, you have to go in. You have to go to the base layer of what's going on. And at the fundamental layer of all of this is breathing. And so actually taking the time to actually reorganize and feel things. Most people, if we were to introduce some sort of a minor breath practice, like the superventilation stuff we did yesterday, that'll stimulate anybody, right? Anybody's going to feel that. But if we do slow, controlled breathing, a lot of people may have problems with that and not feel that just as quickly. And it's more of a long-term thing. So it's something people have to actually put discipline in, right? To understand it. But and this is where that outside in thing comes. People are so stressed out, and it's like, that's all just a conceptualization. That's just story. That's just a narrative. We are designed to handle stress at very high output. And maybe, and then I'm stealing this from a friend of ours, David Bidler, but maybe it's not that we have a disorder. Maybe it's not that, anxiety and all this stress is actually a disorder. Maybe this is just a natural reaction to the amount of stimulus, to the stimulus that we're taking in from the outside and not paying attention to things from the inside. Because when I've met and worked with a lot of high level people, whether athletes, executives, whoever, right? The people that are functioning the highest are shutting out everything else. They're in their environment and what they're in. Like the conversation you and I are having right now. I'm not thinking about the drive that I've got to go do, except right now when I say that, right now I'm distracting myself. And so this is where the context of things starts to happen. And then I start to overload more because I'm in an environment I should be paying attention to, and I'm not feeling what's going on with that and present in that situation. And so breathing is that thing that I can go and bring myself right back and stop a lot of the physiological ramifications of that stuff.
Sure. I mean, we'll get into the mechanics of that shortly. The thing that really resonates with me from what you just said is this whole idea that maybe anxiety or, a whole list of other complaints is an appropriate response to the environment in which we're living. And, as a doctor, this is something I've been wrestling with for a good 5 to 10 years now, that actually, a lot of the time, I think that the body is really smart. The body is clever. The body does what it is meant to do. I spoke to Johan Hari. I don't know if you know Johan. He wrote the book Lost Connections on.
Yeah, I've read.
We had just a phenomenal conversation for about 2 hours on this podcast a few months ago. And again, it's that whole idea that maybe the way we're feeling, this chronic epidemic of lifestyle-driven disease, is actually our bodies doing what they should be doing in a very toxic environment. I went on your Art of Breath course yesterday with you and Rob were teaching, and the other
Danny
and Danny as well, which is fantastic. But I got there slightly rushed. I had to fly in from Santa Rosa to California. I remember we had a chat when I got there, and it was super interesting that you consciously have made a decision, from what I understand, to not live in an environment where you will constantly be fighting these stressful inputs around you. You put yourself into an environment of nature, of calm, of peace. Was that intentional?
Yeah. We call that, and I'll give this to Rob Wilson, paying attention. If you're paying attention to what's going on in you, you start to feel the aspects of your environment. That doesn't mean I couldn't live in LA. I 40 years I spent in this LA basin, right? And I was perfectly fine. It's just I got away 3 years ago into nature out in the middle of nowhere, Oregon, and spent a year there, like 7 acres, 30 minutes from a real town, in the forest. And I got to know myself, and I really got to know myself. And I had already started doing work to start to feel what was going on in me. But it wasn't until I actually understood, like, oh, this is why people actually get away or unplug, right? And you can do that in spaces like LA. And I actually had this very conversation at a barbecue we went to after the seminar yesterday with Dr. Tanya Bentley, who runs the foundation that we work with, at her house. And they live up in a canyon in what seems to be not LA.
Yeah.
And her husband and I were having this conversation. And he literally was just like, I don't know how you do it here outside of this. And I'm like, I get it. Like, I get that. And I don't think enough people understand that there's gotta be this is where that hack world has to come in if we're existing in these places, right? Is we have to actually start to hack things, and breathing is one of those hacks, because I actually believe that if we were still out there, meaning still out in nature, still trying to survive, right? Like cave people, right? Like, we wouldn't even need to be worrying about breathing, because we'd be existing in a natural environment, responding to that natural environment in the way that we should have, right? Versus putting ourselves into places where comfort and convenience and the illusion of safety becomes this very, it encompasses our entire life.
Yeah, for sure. I guess it is in this environment we need to think about breathing. It is in this environment we need to think about physical activity, because I guess, in many environments around the world, in these so-called blue zones where people are living to 100 plus with very low rates of chronic disease, they're not trying to be physically active. They're not trying to have low stress levels. They're not trying to eat healthy food. Their environment is set up where that is the norm for them. So they don't have to think about, I need to go to the gym to work out, because they're moving every day. They're moving to get their food out of the ground, and they're walking around to see their friends and their family. And so, we have to now think about these tools that we need in this modern environment. Mm-hmm. A lot of people listening to this will probably be thinking, well, it's all very well moving out to nature, but I don't have access to that. And so why the breath really fascinates me, because I've worked in many different areas. I've looked after affluent patients. I've also looked after very deprived patients. Mm-hmm. And I guess breathing is free. Mm. Breathing is accessible to everybody. Mm. And then what that naturally lends itself to is, if you have control over your breath, even if you are living in a city where there is a lot of noise around you and there's a lot of inputs that you are constantly having to fight off, well, at least you have a tool like a shield where you can use for your body to help you survive in that environment. Is that fair to say?
Totally fair. It's absolutely fair. That's where this comes in. And it even can come in when when you're on vacation, or you're in the middle of nowhere nature, right? Or camping or whatever. But this is absolutely where it does come in. And it's our ability to shift our state, right? To be the ability, because we're not staying focused anymore. Like ADD, I've got anxiety. Well, if you're dealing with anxiety, like you're just not responding to your current environment. You're thinking of an environment outside of your environment, and you're doing a lot of other stuff that's going on versus actually responding to the current thing that's going on, right? And I understand this intimately. Is I'm that type A person who will overwhelm myself and bite off more than I can chew, and figure that out, right? Like, oh, okay, I overshot the mark here. I need to pull back. Like, I need to stop with all this stimulus. Like, I chose not to fly down here this trip because I'm on planes pretty frequently and I'm going boom, boom, boom. And I decided a 5.5 hour drive both ways will allow me to decompress in a way that jumping on an airplane and being back quickly won't.
Yeah.
Right. So it becomes, what's my environment? So I can't exist in a big city or in a city or not in nature. And I just have to manipulate my environment or listen to my environment in a way that allows me to kind of just be in that place. Right. And breathing is that one of those things that literally brings you, it's why every meditation practice has breathing at the foundation. It really brings you right to that focal point.
It's funny that I think back to when I started doing things like, when I started working out when I was like 15 or 16, and, you'd read the magazines or you'd read what you should be doing. And they'd always say, when, like, I don't know, a bench press, let's say, you, on the way back up, exhale. I used to ignore that stuff. I used to just think, what's the exercise? What's the mechanical exercise that I need to do? Who cares if you're breathing in on the way in and breathing out on the way back up? And now, with the knowledge I have now, I look back and go, wow, how naive was I? And then you can really expand that across, you mentioned these ancient practices like yoga.
Yeah.
Yoga has got breathing at the heart of it. Yet many yoga classes I've been to, certainly a few years ago, and the way I see many people around me practicing yoga is they feel it's a physical practice. I want to be able to stretch my hamstrings so that I can get in this position, almost ignoring the breath part of it. And I've really gone like completely 180 on this, in the sense that I actually think that breathing is at the heart. You get that right, then the physical actions that you want actually follow very, very easily. And you had this beautiful phrase, I think I heard you say once, mind is the king of the senses, breath is the king of the mind.
That's BKS Iyengar. That's me quoting.
That's you quoting him. Yeah. I mean, that is phenomenal. We can maybe unpack that. But do you feel that in the West today, in the 21st century, when we think about working out, movement, yoga, whatever physical practice it is, going to the gym, CrossFit, have we forgotten about the breath?
I would say by and large, most people participating in yoga practice right now around the world are not participating in the way that it was designed. And that doesn't mean I understand it to its totality, but I've been teaching movement and principles of movement for almost 20 years. And we have come to the realization that the way you move is the way you breathe. And thus, controlling the breath controls the way you move. And so yoga nailed this in the beginning and at the foundation with people who actually understand these deep principles. But we all kind of get lost in all these different mediums. And it's not just yoga. Like you talk about CrossFit, running, all of these things, we whatever the medium is, we lose sight of what we're trying to do, because we get caught up in I'm going to burn some calories. I'm going to get bigger. I'm going to get more flexible. No, those are all byproducts of what this does. And why are we doing this? And it's like you brought up the blue zones. And it's interesting about the blue zones is, in no blue zone is anybody going to the gym. So if you're going to sit there and quote, not you, if people are going to sit there and talk about blue zones and what people in the blue zones eat and do and use that to an advantage, well, you better take the consideration that these people live in nature, basically. Yeah. Like they live far from things and they're doing the work based on a lifestyle that most of us, especially using the blue zones as this idea, are doing. And so commit to something like that. And that's all I've done a little bit. Like I'm not doing that fully in any way, shape or form. I'm manipulating the environment in order to suit for how I live a more qualitative life and feel that life. And I'm not looking for necessary longevity of life. I'm looking for quality of life, because I've experienced things like this is a very big rabbit hole, but you just need an abrupt check in your life to really understand things. Usually, most of us, over a little over a year ago, I thought I broke my neck, woke up on the ground, and I had a massive contusion, between C3, C4, that I hit my head going up a ladder playing tag with my nephews, and woke up on the ground and I couldn't move. And I was like, oh, something's wrong. And that event altered how I started really, even though I was thinking about life being this fragile, quick thing, it really was, oh, you just don't even know. You don't even know when it's coming. And yet we behave as though, especially the hacker world, we behave like there's so much fear around dying that it's like, yo, embrace death. Everything's a death. And come to the conclusion that what you're feeling is allowing you to really experience life. And that's in essence why breath at the foundation, and why these yogis and why these people were talking about this, is because it is the center of what it is we're doing.
Yeah. I mean, we're so busy these days, right? Nobody's got time. I really do feel, I've been asked this before, what is the biggest stress in modern society? And my view, and there are multiple ones, my view is it's the erosion of downtime. The fact that we don't have downtime in our lives anymore. Every single minute we look at these damn phones. We get up in the morning, we look at these phones, we stand in line in the coffee shop, and instead of daydreaming and letting our DMN, our default mode network, kick into gear and actually start to solve problems and be creative for us, we're consuming. And you mentioned often we need something abrupt. And, for me, one of the turning points in my life was when my father died, 6.5 years ago. And I used to help, I moved back to where I grew up to help care for my dad for like 10, 15 years. And when my dad died, it forced me to start confronting various things in my life. Was I living the life that I wanted to? Was I simply a mirror reflection of everything I'd grown up around? Or, who was the real me? And I find that as I've gone down that path, and it's a big rabbit hole, but I think it's the most rewarding rabbit hole you'll ever go down, starting to understand myself better. I would have time because Dad wasn't here anymore. All this time that I previously would spend with him, carrying him, showering him, washing him, shaving him, all this kind of stuff. Suddenly with that time, I'd go for a walk. I'd just go and daydream, and I'd start to reflect. And I thought, wow, I've not had time to reflect, to self-reflect on my life, my entire life, but certainly my whole adult life until that point. And once I found that time, once that time was given to me, everything in my life started to come online. I've created a life that I love. I love what I do in my career. I feel very close with my wife and my kids. I feel that I know who I am. And in the last 6 to 12 months, I no longer have a fear of death. And that was quite a long story to try and get to that point. But but it's when you do the internal work, I feel that it leads you to your breath, actually, because after you strip away a few of these layers of the onion, you start to, it takes you to your breath, and you realize, actually, for me, the next level of spiritual growth, if you want to call it, or sort of self-exploration, is to sort of get control of my breath and understand it, and actually start to, really start to play around with it and see how it impacts my mood, how it impacts my state. And I get the impression from, as I say, it's been a few months that I've come across your work, and I get the impression that underneath the breath, there's also been a lot of personal growth with you.
Oh yeah. Yeah. It transformed everything about what I've worked on. I mean, I'd been in the self-help stuff for 20 years, like looking at it, reading it, going through, seeing therapists, going to programs, workshops, all this stuff, this guru, that guru, like all of it, like, hey, what can I learn here? And it wasn't really until I invested in this that any of that really made any sense. And now it's like, we joke about it, but I like the real depth of things, like the true depth of it, like looking at the heart of what my reaction is to something, and I think that is like, that's the gateway opening. That is the entire thing, is looking at and understanding. And we were having this conversation offline, but it's like somebody reacting to you online or something, and how it used to affect us before, and I was the same. It used to affect me. And now it's like, I actually understand the behavior and I can have compassion towards that and understand where somebody's at, because it's not actually being directed at me. This is actually something that is an internal issue in not understanding. And so somebody just doesn't have the tools quite yet to get that. And I think our job to some degree is to, since we've decided to take this exploration on, is to explain what those tools are.
Yeah. I completely agree. I mean, it's almost, I got that sense from you and your team yesterday at Art of Breath that there's almost a deep sense of obligation there as you have got this awareness, you've developed your understanding. It's almost like something you have to spread with the world. You have to understand it more. You have to be able to communicate it and reach people, because it is potentially controlling your breath. Controlling your breath is probably the wrong terminology. Having an awareness of your breath, understanding your breath, being able to manipulate your breath for certain situations is arguably one of the most powerful tools we have. Yet most of us we do have access, but we don't feel we've got access to it. And we don't have the knowledge to access it either.
Yeah. I mean, Eckhart Tolle talks candidly about, he just openly will just say, just be aware of your breath. Like, just be conscious of your breath. Like, get awareness of that. He doesn't give anything else up, right? Like, he's not like, hey, use this pattern to do there's none of that. Right. And I'm only bringing him up because, here's a guy who's really risen up to the top in some very basic, simple ideas in, this self-help or even spiritual realm. Right. And it's great because I think that just the ability to become aware, but most people can't sit there and be aware of their breath. And this is where practices like Vipassana have come in and done tremendous work to where it's like, hey, you're going to go 10 days. Silent meditation, and you're just going to learn to be aware of your breath, and that's it. And after like 3 days, you've felt like you've never been through more pain in your entire life, right? And then all of a sudden you become aware of things as this 10 days comes to a close, right? But I don't think that's actually necessary for everybody, but maybe it is. Like, not everybody should need to go run 100 miles, but I did, and I got that experience and I understand that. And just sitting there and being quiet and paying attention to your breath for maybe 2 minutes or 5 minutes, or if you can do 10 minutes, and you can just continue to do that is enough. That'll teach you more than most things will, because and the reason is because your breath is connected to everything we're doing. Like, it is that thing that's connected to what we're doing. So it responds to the environment. And so becoming aware of that literally opens up the doorway of, oh, I'm just not paying attention to my environment right now. Or, if there is a lion in the corridor, like, you should notice your potentially that's not somewhere where you need to stop and be aware of your breathing, but you'll see in those instances where breaths get hold and then breaths picks up, right? High, stress situations, so it's just, this becomes a very big opening if you can just be aware of it. Now, the optimization factor comes into where I start learning how to manipulate that to bring myself more present or to downshift myself more.
If you want to see the recent one-on-one conversation I had with the inspirational Dr. Gabor Mate, it's a great conversation. I really think you're going to enjoy it. You can check it out right there.
But much of physical pathology can be traced to childhood experiences and how we cope with those experiences and what those experiences did